The sun was just starting to wake the gloomy autumn forest, but Sue was already coming out of it with a basket in her hand, full of ripe cranberries. The out-of-towners would pay well for cranberries like these, and there'd still be some left for herself. Sue looked up. Still early. No need to rush, her mother had promised she could handle the livestock on her own today. Sue's mother was a small, slender woman who'd aged quickly from endless hard work on the farm and at home. She was often sick, and Sue felt sorry for her, always trying to convince her to sell at least some of the animals. "Mom, why do we need so many? Let's keep one pig and the chickens and sell the rest." "What are you talking about?" Jolene would gasp, glancing around nervously, as if afraid her husband might overhear. "How can you have a farm without livestock? Besides, it's all ours: milk, eggs, meat. We can even sell some for a little money." "Little money? Mom, are we poor? Dad works, he can support us. And you're working here too. Anyway, I'm going to move out soon." But all Sue's pleas never made any difference. And Sue knew why. Her mother was afraid of Sue's father. Bob was a sullen, quiet man, and his family rarely heard a kind word from him. Now and then, he'd smile at Jolene or gently pat Sue on the head, and on those days, Jolene and Sue felt like they were floating on air. But Sue also knew that her father loved them and cared, even if he didn't show it. His eyes grew soft whenever he looked at her mother. Jolene, however, didn't seem to notice. She was weighed down by a feeling of guilt over having just one child, unable to meet her husband's gaze because of it. So, she tried tirelessly to be a good farm wife. "It's okay," Sue would tell herself. "I'll get married and give Dad a whole bunch of grandkids so Mom won't feel guilty anymore." Sue reached a steep slope that led to a meadow near the road to town. Someone was on the meadow. At first, Sue was scared, thinking it might be a bear, but then shook herself out of it. Bears? Really? She hid behind a tree and looked carefully. In the meadow, sitting on a fallen tree, was a man, cloaked from head to toe in black. Even from that distance, Sue could tell he wasn't local. No one in town dressed like that, and none had a backpack like his, which was clearly store-bought, with numerous buckles, straps, and pockets. Suddenly, the man turned and looked straight at Sue, who was peeking from behind the trees. Startled, she jerked back, tripped over a branch, and tumbled down the slope, rolling right to the stranger's feet. "Are you okay?" Sue heard a calm, low voice above her. She looked up and saw the man leaning over her. His blue eyes stood out sharply against his tanned, stubbly face. "Let me help you up." Sue hesitantly held out her hand, but as she tried to stand, a sharp pain shot through her leg, and with a gasp, she fell back to the ground. "What? Where does it hurt?" the man asked, frowning. Sue pointed at her leg. He knelt beside her and started feeling around her ankle. "What are you doing?" Sue exclaimed, momentarily forgetting the pain at his boldness. "Checking your leg. It doesn't seem broken, just a sprain. I'll set it for you." At these words, Sue instinctively pulled her leg back and immediately burst into tears from the intense pain. "Don't be afraid, I'm a doctor. It'll hurt, but then you'll be able to walk to the hospital." No, thank you. I'll manage on my own." Sue looked at the stranger with alarm. "You won't make it on your own. Roll up your pant leg." His tone turned suddenly icy. Sniffling, Sue obeyed, freeing her leg from the fabric and her sock. When she was ready, the stranger handed her a sturdy branch and ordered, "Hold onto this with both hands. You can even bite it if you need to." Sue gripped the branch, squeezed her eyes shut, and began silently praying. She wasn't sure what scared her more, this man or what he was about to do to her leg. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her entire body, and Sue blacked out. When she came to, her leg still burned with pain, but it was more bearable now. "Awake?" The stranger's serious face appeared before her. "Think you can walk, or do you need a bit longer?" "No. Let's go." With his help, Sue stood up. Lean on me, he said, and Sue cautiously took his arm. Oh, my berries, she exclaimed suddenly. Berries? You can barely carry yourself. No, no. I'm not leaving without them. The man sighed heavily, then swung his backpack onto his chest and picked up Sue's basket with one hand. Sue leaned on his other arm. Slowly and painfully, they made it to the road. After a short rest, they started moving toward the town. At this pace, I'll be home by evening, Sue thought sadly and stole a glance at her rescuer. He looked like any other man, just very tired and maybe a bit grumpy because of it. His long coat hid his frame, but from the way he was carrying his large backpack, Sue's berry basket, and Sue herself, she figured he was pretty strong. Just then, they heard the sound of a cart approaching from behind. Who's this you're bringing along, Sue? An old man called out as his cart, pulled by a lively horse, pulled up beside them. It was old Ray, looking at her companion with interest. Oh, Ray. I'm so glad we ran into you. Can you give us a ride? I twisted my ankle, and it hurts to walk, Sue said. Hop on, of course. The man helped load their things onto the cart, helped Sue climb in, and then got in himself. And who might you be, young man? Ray asked, looking at the stranger with curiosity, while Sue watched him too, curious for his answer. My name's Tyler. I'm headed to Bluemont. Oh, that's where we're going, Ray said happily. What for? I was sent from the city. They said you needed a doctor. We sure do. Ray nodded eagerly. Poor Mrs. Perkins has been covering everything on her own, and she's 70, same as me. What's your specialty? Surgery. But I can handle general practice too. That's good. But why'd you come through the forest? Sue said she ran into you in the woods. The bus broke down, so I decided to walk. They told me it'd be quicker to go straight through the forest. How'd you manage not to get lost? Ray asked, surprised. Our forests are tricky, even the rangers sometimes lose their way. Guess I got lucky. As Ray talked with Tyler, Sue kept her eyes fixed on him. He'd taken off his hood, revealing a close-cropped haircut, like a military style. Something about this Tyler didn't quite add up. The cart rolled into the town. Where to, Sue? Home. I'd suggest you go to the clinic first, Tyler said, looking at her with concern. Your leg should be checked again, treated, and rewrapped. Oh, no need. Sue waved him off. It hardly hurts anymore. I'll go, if it gets worse. Tyler looked like he wanted to argue, but Ray cut in. She's right. No sense in troubling doctors for no reason. Where do you need to go, Tyler? To the town hall, Tyler sighed, understanding that arguing was useless. Finally, my requests have been heard. William, the town's mayor, shook Tyler's hand enthusiastically, practically beaming. I'm so glad they sent us such a skilled doctor. Usually, specialists like you are kept close to the big city. Tyler simply smiled, choosing not to mention that he had insisted on being assigned to this far-off little town. Now, let me show you the house we've set up for you. It's a nice place. I'll arrange for firewood to be delivered tomorrow. Great. But let's also check out my workplace right away, Tyler suggested. Of course, of course. Sue. What on earth happened? Sue's mother rushed out to her limping daughter. Ray followed behind, carrying the basket of berries. She fell and twisted her ankle, he explained. Good thing she ran into our new doctor, he helped her out. Otherwise, she might not have made it back until dark. A doctor? Jolene looked at him, surprised. Yes. Ray grinned, clearly delighted to share the news first. Finally, we've got a specialist. A real surgeon. Well, that's news. Jolene took the basket from Ray and carried it into the house. She turned back to him from the doorway. Want to come in? No, no. I'll go tell the missus. She'll be thrilled. Ray headed back to his cart. Sue hobbled into the house and sank into a chair. Tired? Her mother gently stroked her head. Why'd you pick so many? Oh, Mom, there were just so many. I couldn't leave them there. Sue smiled, pressing her cheek against her mother's hand. Change your clothes, and I'll get you some food, Jolene said, pulling her hand back gently. Where's Dad? He went to the farm. Lance came by asking for help, so he headed out. Lance was Sue's fiancé, a tall, handsome young man. All of Sue's friends were envious. Lance was the most eligible bachelor in town. Not only was he good-looking, but he was hardworking and ambitious. He never left a goal unfinished, and everyone predicted a bright future for him. You're going to have such a happy life with him, her friends would sigh. Lance will make something of himself. Maybe he'll even be mayor one day. Sue just smiled. She loved Lance, and it didn't matter to her if he became mayor or not, as long as she could be with him. She could hardly believe it when he first showed interest in her. She, a regular girl from an ordinary family, had caught the eye of the most desirable young man in town. And to top it off, his family was one of the wealthiest and most respected, with the town's mayor being Lance's uncle. But Lance had been persistent in courting her, and soon Sue fell in love and began dating him. The proposal came almost immediately, and both families decided to hold the wedding right after the harvest season. Who was that man who came out of the woods with you? Lance's voice came from the doorway. Oh, Lance, you're here. Sue sprang up from the couch to greet him, but a sharp pain in her leg forced her back down. Lance frowned, then reluctantly stepped closer. What happened? I fell and twisted my ankle. Luckily, there was a man in the woods, a surgeon, actually, who helped me. He's on his way to work in our town. A surgeon? In our woods? Isn't that something? Sue didn't understand why Lance looked so grim. And where is he now? He went to see the mayor. I see. Well, take care and get better, Lance said, giving her a quick peck on the cheek before heading out. I need to find out more about this surgeon, he thought to himself, feeling suspicious of the whole encounter. How are you settling in, Tyler? William, the town's mayor, asked with a smile, looking around the new doctor's office. Pretty well, thanks. Just a few changes I'd like to make and maybe add some equipment, Tyler replied. Add? We don't have anything else to add, William said, throwing his hands up. Well, we will, Tyler said confidently, smiling. Oh, you're optimistic, dear, Mrs. Perkins chimed in, walking into the office. When I started here, I was also full of ideas for improvements, but our district barely listens to us. They hardly ever listen to women, Tyler said softly, winking at her, but I'm a man, and I speak loudly. We'll see about that, she sighed, then remembered why she'd come. Oh. You'll need a nurse, won't you? I can't give you mine, though. So, what now? She turned to William. Guess we'll have to request one from the city. William replied. No need, Mrs. Perkins said with a triumphant smile. My niece Carol is moving here. She's a nurse, and she's got experience. But isn't she in Seattle? Why is she moving here? She got divorced and decided to come back home. Oh my. William shook his head. She's so young, why would she leave a big city for this little backwater? What's wrong with it here? It's peaceful and has fresh air. Anyway, she'll be here in a few days, I'll send her over right away. Mrs. Perkins headed for the door but stopped just before leaving. Oh, Tyler, come by my office later. I'll give you some patient files, cases right up your alley. Sure thing, Mrs. Perkins, Tyler nodded. The sun was barely thinking of rising when Sue got up. Yesterday, she'd left all the chores to her mom, and today she wanted to spare her as much as possible. Besides, Jolene had her own work to go to today. Carefully, Sue got out of bed, her leg was still sore, dressed, and quietly started getting the food ready for the animals. When she was done, she took 2 buckets of feed for the pigs, tucked a sack of grain for the chickens under her arm, and stepped outside. Just as she headed toward the pigsty, a rooster darted underfoot, chasing a hen. She stumbled over it, lost her balance, and crashed to the ground, her buckets clattering. Pain shot through her injured leg like fire, and she let out a yelp. Bob burst onto the porch in his underwear, taking in the scene before rushing to her side. "Sue, why'd you load yourself up with so much?" he asked, his tone both scolding and concerned. "I just wanted to help Mom," Sue sniffled, fighting back tears. "She's struggling, and I left her to do everything by herself yesterday." "What do you mean, by herself? What am I here for?" Bob asked, surprised. "Of course I'll help. I see how hard it is on her, and I'm always ready to pitch in. But she keeps doing everything quietly." Bob sighed deeply. "You should talk to her, Sue. Tell her not to turn down my help. One day you'll get married and move out, and she'll wear herself out, and I won't even know." "I will, Dad. I just didn't realize. Always ask for help. I'm not refusing, am I? A husband's duty is to help his wife." "Dad." Sue hugged him around the neck. "You're the best." Yeah, I know." Bob patted her head. "Now, come on, let's get you inside. I'll handle feeding the animals." "Myself," he said sternly, meeting her eyes. Sue nodded quickly. Bob carefully helped her up, but as soon as she put weight on her leg, she gasped. The pain was unbearable. Her dad muttered, frowning. "Seems more serious than I thought. You said you ran into our new doctor in the woods yesterday?" Sue nodded. "We'll have to go see him." Jolene, looking alarmed, met them at the door. "What happened?" she asked, panic in her voice. "What happened?" "Our daughter's hurt herself." Bob growled, then added, more calmly, "Help her get ready. I'm taking her to the doctor." Jolene gently helped Sue get dressed. Once she was ready, Bob lifted her in his arms and headed for the door. He paused on the threshold, looked at his wife with a stern expression, and said, "Don't lift anything while I'm gone. I'll take care of it when I get back." Then he stepped outside. He settled Sue into the car, started it up, and they drove off. "We're probably too early," Sue said when they arrived at the small hospital building. "No matter. We'll wait." But waiting wasn't necessary. A sleepy-looking man peeked out from the doorway. Sue barely recognized her forest acquaintance. Seeing her, he walked over and, giving her a reproachful look, offered her his hand. "I told you to come to the doctor right away." "What happened?" "Well, I tried to help my mom and took on too much. And if that rooster hadn't gotten underfoot, I wouldn't have fallen." Sue tried to explain. "Oh, for heaven's sake. All right, let me help." Tyler supported her on one side, while Bob took the other. With the two of them helping, Sue hopped along on one leg until they reached the doctor's office. Tyler stared absently out the open window, absent-mindedly crushing a cigarette in his hand. Realizing he'd mangled it beyond use, he cursed, tossed it aside, and shut the window. He couldn't get that girl out of his mind. The look in her young face had triggered a wave of memories. He remembered lying in thick, tall grass. It was a dark, quiet night, with the sky full of stars shining like diamonds. But he wasn't looking at those stars, he was focused on other stars, the ones shining in Layla's eyes. His Layla. She gazed at him softly, tracing her slender fingers across his cheek. He took her hand and kissed it. Within a few hours, those stars would dim, never to shine again. That's what he thought, until this morning. When he'd groggily stepped out of the hospital and seen yesterday's forest acquaintance with a huge bearded man, he'd known right away why they had come so early. He helped them to his office, then sat Sue down to examine her leg. As he took her small, delicate ankle in his hand, he felt an almost electric jolt. Automatically, he looked up and he found himself once again in the tall, thick grass, staring up at the stars. But these weren't just stars in the night sky, they were the stars shining in the eyes of the girl he'd met in the forest. "What's going on, Doctor?" Her father's concerned voice broke through, and Tyler realized he'd been gazing at Sue for too long. "Ah, yes," Tyler cleared his throat, trying to gather himself. "Well, it's a sprain, but it's manageable. I'll wrap it for support and prescribe some pain relief. And absolutely no physical strain. At least until the end of the week." He shot a stern look at her father. Yes. Bob nodded quickly. "Of course. Come back tomorrow, same time," Tyler said, turning his gaze back to Sue. "Carefully, on your own, if you can. Try not to put weight on that leg. Better yet, find something to lean on for support." "Don't worry, sweetheart," Bob said, hugging Sue, thinking her sad, thoughtful look was due to worry about her mother. "I told you I'd help with the chores." "Thanks, Dad," Sue said, giving his large, calloused hand a squeeze. If only he knew that her thoughts were far from her mother. She couldn't get Tyler's blue-eyed gaze out of her mind. The way he'd looked at her, it was as if she were the only person in his world. For a moment, she even thought he was going to kiss her. She shook her head quickly. No. She must have imagined it. I wonder what it would be like to kiss him. Sue blushed, embarrassed by the thought. And more shameful thoughts crowded in. She'd kissed Lance before and enjoyed it, but somehow, she just knew that a kiss from Tyler would be nothing like kissing Lance. Tyler was a grown man, likely experienced enough to know how to kiss in a way that would make a woman completely his. Enough, she scolded herself sharply. "You're practically married to a man you love. And you're thinking about another man." Tyler cursed under his breath as yet another unsmoked cigarette was tossed into the grass. He thought he'd left his memories behind. He thought that by escaping to this remote town, he could bury his sorrow and start over. Maybe not as happily as he'd once dreamed, but at least peacefully. He hoped the pain would eventually dull, leaving only a distant sadness. But this sweet girl with those familiar eyes had stirred up emotions and memories he'd worked hard to bury deep inside. She wasn't like Layla in any real way, except for those eyes. Well, maybe her delicate frame, too. But how had just one look from her managed to shake his hard-won calm that he'd thought unbreakable? Tyler took out another cigarette and finally lit it. He needed to get her out of his mind and regain his balance. She was too young for him, and besides, she was about to marry someone else. He had no right to even think of her that way. He would manage. He'd get past this, again. Sue dreamt about her wedding. She and Lance were walking away from the ceremony, then heading home to sit at a richly laid table. Guests were eating, drinking, laughing. Lance smiled at her, and they kissed. Suddenly, his soft, gentle lips became firmer, the kiss more demanding. But Sue wasn't scared. Quite the opposite, she enjoyed the sudden passion and wanted more. She opened her eyes, ready to whisper to Lance that they should slip away from the guests. But instead of Lance, she found herself looking into Tyler's intense, passionate blue eyes. He was still kissing her, his insistence impossible to resist. "So, you must be my boss?" A striking blonde stood in the doorway, wearing a medical coat. "And you're Carol, I presume?" Tyler looked up from his paperwork. Clearly, Carol had put thought into her appearance for the new job. Her standard coat had been tailored to accentuate her figure, with just a few top buttons undone, not too much, but enough to leave something to the imagination. Open-toed shoes on a modest heel highlighted her legs, and a nude-toned makeup completed the look of a city beauty. "That's me," she said, fluttering her lashes and giving him an expectant look. Tyler gestured to the chair across from his desk, and Carol immediately took her seat. "Carol, let me say this right off, even though we don't have many people here in Bluemont, and it may seem like there's not much work, I still expect a high standard and diligence in your duties. Did I already do something wrong?" Her eyes became suddenly serious, even a little worried. "No. You didn't know my expectations yet. But I'd like to ask that you arrive a bit earlier each day. How much earlier is up to you, but you and your workstation should be fully prepared by the start of the workday. All right, Tyler. Understood. Tyler smoked nervously behind the hospital. The morning rounds were over, and he'd left Carol to sort through the patient files. With her help, things were much easier now. She handled reports, prescriptions, and paperwork, all things that Tyler used to manage himself. He was pleasantly surprised by how professional she turned out to be. He felt a twinge of shame over his curt instructions to her that morning. He could have delivered them in a friendlier way, but earlier that morning, he'd finished the last dressing on Sue's ankle. Her leg had healed, and she didn't need any further treatment. Tyler had grown used to seeing her bright eyes each morning, to holding her delicate ankle and hearing her soft voice. Every time she left, he found himself wondering why this girl affected him so deeply. She wasn't anything like Layla. The eyes he'd first thought familiar weren't brown like Layla's, they were green, darkening with any strong emotion. Her small frame was delicate, yes, but Layla had had an inner strength and resilience. Sue, by contrast, seemed like she might faint at any moment of distress. What was it about this girl that pulled him in so strongly? Tyler kept searching for an answer but couldn't find one. All he knew after this morning was that he didn't want to say goodbye. Understanding that today was probably the last time he'd see her up close or touch her at all left him agitated. He tried to calm himself, to stop thinking about her, but he couldn't. And that just made him angrier. Come on, I want to show you something. Lance stood in the doorway. Sue jumped, looking at her fiancé with surprise. Hey! What were you so deep in thought about that you didn't even see me come in? Lance frowned, and Sue quickly smiled to calm him. I was just imagining our wedding, picturing how it'll all go. It'll go fine. Lance waved his hand dismissively. Now, come on, get ready. Sue threw on her coat, slipped into her boots, and followed him outside. Soft flakes of the first snow began to fall on her face. Winter was coming. Not much time was left until the wedding, and her parents were busy buying supplies, gifts, and preparing for the arrival of relatives. In her closet hung her wedding dress and veil. White boots and a light fur coat waited for their big day. Just a few weeks ago, Sue could hardly wait for the wedding, counting down the days, dreaming of the life she and Lance would share, the family they'd have, and how they'd be the happiest couple in the world. That was before she met the doctor. His gaze, and that dream. It haunted her. Anytime she let her thoughts wander, that kiss from her dream came back to her. Every morning at her bandage change with Tyler, she didn't know where to look. It felt like he knew everything, about the dream, about how her body and thoughts reacted to his touch. Today had been the last bandage change. Part of her had been waiting for it, hoping that once she stopped going to the hospital, this strange obsession would disappear. But part of her didn't want it to end. These were the thoughts Lance interrupted. He took her hand and led her down the street. She couldn't help but notice how different his hands were from Tyler's. Lance's were strong, even a bit rough, while Tyler's were strong yet somehow gentle. He led her to a large, new house. Look. In a week, after our first night together, we'll move in. Lance looked at her expectantly. Are you happy? Yes. Of course. Sue tried to sound cheerful, but it didn't come across convincingly. What, you're not happy? Lance's brows drew together. No. Sue answered quickly. I am happy. I'm just a little nervous about the first night. Her cheeks flushed deep red. Oh, come on. Everyone goes through it. Lots of people even enjoy it. Lance said, trying to reassure her. What if I don't like it? Sue murmured. Well, you'll just have to get used to it. How else are you going to please your husband? I'll be your husband, and a wife's first duty is to satisfy her husband, Lance said firmly. But seeing how anxious she looked, he pulled her close. Don't worry. I'll make sure you like it. He leaned down and kissed her. She closed her eyes and returned the kiss, but in her mind, she saw Tyler. Bob's birthday happened to fall on a day off. At first, he hadn't wanted to celebrate with the wedding so close, but Jolene insisted. After all, family was already coming into town, so why not have a little family gathering? "Don't worry about the dinner," said Dominic, Bob's older brother. "Of course I'll help out my little brother. We don't get to see each other often enough." "It's not that," Bob hesitated. "My daughter's wedding is coming up, and here I am, thinking about my birthday." "When's the wedding?" "Next week. We'll celebrate your birthday quietly, just a little family gathering." But just family turned out to be a large group: relatives, future in-laws, friends, colleagues. They cleared out the largest room and set up tables for everyone. From early morning, the women were busy cooking. Bob, who decided to slaughter a pig for the occasion, was outside with the men. Everyone had something to do. Everyone, that is, except Sue. Sue tried to sew, but the needle wouldn't cooperate. She tried reading, but the words blurred before her eyes. After a moment's thought, she decided to go for a walk. For the past week, something had been bothering her, an anxiety that only seemed to grow. Deep down, she suspected it had to do with the doctor, though she was afraid to admit it to herself. She reached the edge of the forest and was about to turn back when she noticed movement among the trees. Looking closer, she saw something large and dark moving toward her. Fear froze her in place. Her mind screamed, "Run," but her body wouldn't respond. "Sue? Out for an early walk?" Tyler's blue eyes met hers. "Tyler, you scared me." Relief and a strange joy flooded her. "I thought you were a bear." Tyler laughed, a warm, contagious laugh. "A bear? Ha! Even I know the bears are hibernating by now. And you're practically a forest girl yourself." He laughed so warmly that she couldn't stay mad at him, and she joined in, laughing with him. "It's just that your cloak hides all your arms and legs, so from a distance, it looks like something big and scary coming toward you. Not knowing what it is makes it even scarier." "Ha ha ha," the doctor laughed again. "You've got quite the imagination, Sue. If you're done with your walk, I can walk you home." Sue nodded, blushing again. They started down the path toward town, walking slowly side by side. "Tell me a little about yourself, Sue." "Well, I'm just an ordinary girl, like any other here. I don't have any education or job." "Why didn't you go to college or work, Sue? You don't seem like a girl without ambition." "Thank you. But right after high school, I got engaged. My fiancé and father agreed that before the wedding, my parents would support me, and after the wedding, it would be my husband's responsibility. So, they said I didn't need to work. There's plenty to do at home, after all. And if that's the case, they figured there was no point in me studying either." "I see," Tyler said, stopping to look her directly in the eyes. "So your duties will be to take care of your family and home?" "Seems that way," Sue shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "Wouldn't you want to be something more? Besides a housewife?" "I used to dream of being a teacher," she trailed off, continuing down the path to her house. Tyler followed silently. "But now, I'm about to get married, I'll have children. When would I have time for studying or working?" Sue said, almost apologetically. They walked the rest of the way in silence until they reached her house. "Tyler," her father called out, noticing them. "Come on in." Tyler followed Sue through the gate. She quickly slipped into the house and went to the window. She couldn't hear what her father and the doctor were talking about, but seeing her father's smile and their handshake, she realized Tyler had accepted the invitation to birthday party. As he made his way back toward the gate, Tyler glanced up directly at her window and smiled. Sue jumped back, pressing herself against the wall, feeling certain he knew she'd been watching him. The tables were loaded with food. What was supposed to be a modest family celebration had turned into a feast. Bob, grumbling about how it all turned out far grander than planned, struggled with his tie. Frustrated, he finally threw it aside. "Oh, Bob, why are you so annoyed?" Jolene stepped up and quickly tied it for him. "What's wrong with celebrating your birthday properly? My daughter's getting married in a few days, and here I am celebrating my birthday," he muttered, still trying to sound grumpy. "A wedding is a wedding, and a birthday is a birthday. And when was the last time all our relatives came for your birthday? Who knows when they'll all be together like this again? It's worth celebrating, I'd say." Bob looked at his wife. Jolene was dressed in a lovely gown, a set of jewelry sparkling on her neck and ears, and her hair done up beautifully. She'd even worn a touch of makeup, something she hadn't done in years. Bob felt a pang of guilt. How rarely he'd given his wife a chance to dress up, to feel beautiful. Tears pricked his eyes, and to hide them, he pulled Jolene into a hug. Jolene, unused to such tenderness, shyly hugged him back. Bob shivered slightly and, without realizing it, leaned in to kiss her. Sue quietly closed the door to her room, smiling at the scene she'd just witnessed between her parents. They loved each other, and that gave her hope that everything would be all right. Inspired by her mother's example, Sue decided to dress up too. She didn't have much in the way of fancy clothes, but she did have a couple of nice dresses. She chose a yellow one with a bow at the waist that showed off her figure and made her eyes shine. She added green earrings and a matching pendant. Leaving her hair down, it fell in light waves over her back. "Oh, honey, you look beautiful," Jolene said admiringly, giving Bob a proud look. Her father couldn't take his eyes off her. "Yes, our little girl's grown up into a real beauty." Bob discreetly wiped a tear from his eye. Lance also appreciated how she looked. "I knew I made the right choice. You're the most beautiful girl in town." Guests started gathering, finding seats at the table. One toast after another was made. Despite her lovely dress, Sue did her best to help her mother, clearing dishes, bringing out more food, refilling drinks. When she went to the kitchen at one point, she saw that the sink was full of dirty dishes. Without a second thought, she put on an apron and started washing them. She heard a sound behind her and, thinking it was her mother, turned quickly, ready to insist that she didn't need help. Instead, she found herself face to face with Tyler. His blue eyes held a look of admiration that wrapped around her. I was looking for, water." "Yes. Water," he finally managed to say. Water. It's right there, in the pitcher." Sue gestured to the table where the pitcher stood. Tyler was so close she could hear his breathing, and it made her pulse race. She quickly turned back to the sink, scrubbing the dishes. Tyler stepped over to the pitcher, poured himself a glass, and downed it in one gulp. "You look wonderful," he said, regaining his composure a bit. "Thank you. You do too. Need a hand?" "No, I'm just finishing up." The celebration was in full swing. Guests were having a great time, and the wine was flowing freely. Even Lance, who wasn't much of a drinker, was already quite drunk. Sue, sitting beside him, noticed how often he kept refilling his glass. "Lance," she leaned into him, "maybe you should take a break. You're really drunk." "Me?" Lance looked at her, squinting. "What are you talking about? A man doesn't get drunk, he just gets a little tipsy. And you shouldn't be getting involved in this. You're not allowed to drink, but I am." Sue sighed heavily. From across the table, Uncle Dominic watched them with a thoughtful expression, his gaze lingering on Lance. The guests were getting to that point where no one wanted to sit still anymore, and dancing had started in the yard. Sue leaned against the house, watching her father, despite his broad frame and height, twirling around her mother. "Your parents are wonderful people," said a familiar voice behind her, soft and warm, wrapping around her like a blanket. "Yes, I know," she replied. "I'm sure yours were, too. My parents have been gone for a long time. They died when I was still a teenager." "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "It's okay. It's not your fault. They were ill for a long time." I used to dream of growing up and becoming a doctor so I could heal them. But I didn't get the chance. I'm truly sorry. Sue looked at Tyler, his blue eyes close to hers. They stood in the shadows, the sounds of the party fading into the background. His lips were so close, and his gaze said it all. I want to kiss you. Sue's lips parted slightly, her eyes slowly closing. She felt his breath as he leaned in, his lips nearing hers. Sue, why aren't you dancing? Uncle Dominic's voice boomed, shattering the moment and making them step back from each other. I guess I'm just tired, Sue mumbled, her face flushing with embarrassment as she hurried back inside. Tyler and Dominic were left standing by the wall. Smoke? Dominic offered Tyler an open cigarette case. I'll take one, Tyler said, taking a cigarette. They both took a drag. If I were you, I wouldn't let her end up with that fool, Dominic said after a moment, taking a long drag. I think I'm a little too old for her, Tyler replied, trying to hide his surprise. And he's much too wrong for her. And I'd be right? You'd be a far better choice. Dominic tossed his half-smoked cigarette to the ground, turned, and went back inside without another word. Sue ran into the house, breathless, and stopped, mortified. Uncle Dominic had seen everything. What must he think? Her eyes fell on Lance, who was sitting alone at the table, pouring himself yet another drink. Lance, what are you doing? She asked, distressed. You're going to get completely drunk. Not your business. Go have fun. You got all dressed up for that guy anyway, didn't you? Don't care that your future husband's sitting here alone, huh? What are you talking about, Lance? Sue approached him, putting a hand on his shoulder. You need some fresh air. How about I walk you outside? Yeah, walk me, Lance muttered, wobbling to his feet. Sue quickly fetched his coat and draped it over him. They stepped into the backyard, where the moon cast a faint light. Listen, Sue, Lance turned to her, we're getting married soon, aren't we? Yes, she answered, uncertain of his point. It's all settled, no turning back? Sue nodded, eyeing him curiously. Then why wait for our wedding night? Let's do it now. Lance. Just a few more days, can't you wait? Sue didn't like the look in his eyes. Why should I wait? You're going to be my wife anyway, so what's the difference? He grabbed her and began roughly tugging at her clothes. But I wanted it to be special, Sue struggled, his grip suddenly like iron. She felt a horrible shame that she couldn't scream. A scream would disgrace her and her family. Come on, stop playing coy. I know you want it, too, but you're just acting all innocent to impress my family. Lance held her tightly, dragging her toward the shed. Sue fought as hard as she could, but she couldn't break free from his drunken grip. Once inside, he threw her onto a pile of hay and fell on top of her. Sue's silent tears flowed. Lance, isn't your wedding night supposed to be in a few days? Tyler finished his cigarette, tossing the butt away. The last time he'd felt so deeply overwhelmed by his emotions had been with Layla. One look at her used to make him forget everything else. He had thought that her death and time had hardened his emotions. But now, just one look from Sue, and all his restraint melted away. It was as if she had cast a spell on him, making him want only one thing, to take her away from everything and keep her by his side forever. The guests, evidently worn out from dancing, headed back inside to enjoy some food. Tyler didn't want to follow. He was nervous about meeting Sue's eyes again and revealing his feelings, not just to her, but to everyone around. He lit another cigarette and took a walk around the house. As he approached the backyard, he heard Sue's distressed voice and sounds of a struggle. Quickening his pace, he saw Lance dragging a resisting Sue toward the shed. It looked like Lance was planning to take what he considered his marital rights without waiting for the wedding. Tyler froze, unsure of what to do. On one hand, this wasn't his business, they were engaged, and soon enough, they'd be married and could do as they pleased. But on the other hand, it was clear Sue didn't want this. When he heard her stifled sobs from inside the shed, Tyler acted without hesitation. He rushed in, and the scene that met him left no doubt that Sue was unwilling. "Lance, isn't your wedding night still a few days away? Get lost." Lance snapped, not even bothering to look up, focused on what he was doing. Tyler grabbed him by the shoulders and forcibly yanked him away, shoving him into the corner of the shed. "Hey!" Lance staggered to his feet and lunged at Tyler, fists swinging. "What right do you have to tell me what I can or can't do with my woman? She's not your woman, not yet. And after tonight, I hope she'll reconsider whether she wants to be," Tyler replied, shoving him back. "Oh, I get it," Lance sneered, wiping blood from his lip. "You've got your eye on her too? Don't even think about it. I'll make sure you two never get a moment of peace, anywhere." Lance lunged again, but Tyler's well-aimed punch sent him sprawling further back into the shed, where he slumped into silence. "Nice punch," came a familiar voice. Tyler turned to see Dominic standing at the entrance. "He'll be out till morning now." "Good for him. Where'd you learn to hit like that?" "A few places," Tyler replied, helping a tearful Sue to her feet. He helped her straighten her clothes, then gently pulled her into his arms. "I went inside and noticed that neither my niece nor this fool was around. Got a bad feeling right away. Checked the yard, no one. Walked out front, still no one. Decided to take a look out back, seems you beat me to it," Dominic said with a grin. "Sorry about that." Tyler managed a slight smile. "All right, I'll leave you to it. Take care of her, though. She'll need it." "I will," Tyler said seriously. Dominic turned to Sue. "Think carefully about that wedding, Sue. Your fiancé's an idiot." Sue buried her face in Tyler's shoulder, sobbing as Dominic walked away. Tyler wrapped an arm around her shoulders and led her to the garden. He helped her to a bench in a small gazebo, then sat beside her, pulling her close again. "How are you?" he asked softly, leaning in to see her face. "Better," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tyler kissed the top of her head. "You should listen to your uncle. Lance isn't right for you." "Tyler, don't get me wrong. I'm not defending him, but he just got drunk tonight. He doesn't usually drink. Tonight was just. Doesn't usually drink, but drank tonight," Tyler said with a hint of sarcasm, not liking how she tried to make excuses for Lance. "You know, lately, I've been thinking," Sue took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Maybe I rushed into this wedding." "Oh?" Tyler looked at her intently, sensing something important in her gaze. "Yes. I feel like I don't love Lance the way a bride should love her groom before a wedding." "And how should she feel?" Tyler had a hunch about what she might say, and his heart beat faster. "Well, she should want to be with him all the time, touch him, count down the hours until they can be together forever, and kiss him." Tyler gently took her chin, lifting her face to meet his gaze. Her green eyes sparkled with warmth, her lips slightly parted, as if waiting for him. Slowly, he leaned in, covering her mouth with his in a kiss. Sue sighed softly and wrapped her arms around his neck. They lost track of time as they kissed, the world around them fading away. When he finally pulled back, Tyler looked into her eyes, wanting to be sure he hadn't misread her feelings. But there was no doubt, she gazed at him with hope and tenderness. He knew he was right. He had to save her from this fiancé. "It's getting late," Sue whispered. "They'll notice I'm gone." "All right, let's go," Tyler said, putting an arm around her and leading her back to the house. When they reached the door, he paused, looking at her seriously. "Sue, think about what your uncle said. I agree with him completely." "Oh, so now that I let you kiss me, I'm supposed to take all your advice?" Her voice held a hint of anger. "What do you expect me to say to my parents, who already think of his family as relatives? What am I supposed to tell all the guests who came from far away? How do I return all the money spent on this wedding?" Tears glistened in her eyes. Tyler looked at her closely, then spoke gently. "All the things you just mentioned are nothing compared to a broken life. Not everyone will judge you for this. I certainly won't. You'd finally be able to focus on your education, get the job you've always wanted. And if you're afraid of judgment, don't be. I won't let anyone hurt you. Oh? What? You'll silence everyone? If that's what it takes, yes. And if you agree, I'll marry you myself. Sue pulled back, stunned. Marry you? I think you know I care about you. So yes, I'd marry you. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she gave in to an impulse, throwing her arms around Tyler's neck, intending just to give him a quick peck on the cheek. But he caught her, held her close, and kissed her, a long, gentle kiss. Reluctantly pulling away and whispering, "Goodbye," Sue slipped back into the house. Tyler looked thoughtfully up at the sky before heading off. Inside, a large shadow shifted by the window. Bob sat on his bed, staring pensively at a family photo. Carol eyed herself critically in the mirror one last time. The status of a divorcee wasn't ideal in a small town, it was something she needed to change. The trouble was, there weren't many candidates, actually, there was only one, Tyler. From the first moment, she could tell he wasn't like the locals, too reserved, refined, distant. Maybe it came from his profession, he was a surgeon, after all. And when she'd sneaked a look at his file, she discovered he'd spent the last 5 years in conflict zones. Tyler was a military surgeon, which meant stability, certain privileges, and compensation that would be good for their future family. But Tyler was proving to be a tough nut to crack. He barely noticed her as a woman. His blue eyes were always distant, cold. "Ed Perkins," Carol said, finally admitting defeat, "what do I do? He doesn't even look at me." "Well, stop trying to show off for him. He's a serious man, your charms aren't going to surprise him. You'd be better off feeding him." Ed Perkins smiled knowingly. "What? Feed him? What am I, a cook?" Carol grimaced. "I didn't even cook for my husband. Which is probably why he left you. Men get hungry after staring at a woman's charms. What do you think? You're going to satisfy him just by showing yourself off again? No, dear. You've got to feed a man." "But I don't know how to cook," Carol admitted, taken aback. "Then it's time to learn," Perkins replied firmly. "And I'll help you." Bob and Dominic were cleaning up the yard, both looking thoughtful and grim. "Bob," Jolene said, stepping out onto the porch wrapped in a shawl, "you two look so down. How about a beer?" The men exchanged glances. "Sure, Jolene," said Dominic. She disappeared inside and returned a few minutes later with some beer and hot stew. "Here's to you, brother, happy birthday again." Dominic clinked his bottle against Bob's and took a deep swig. "You've got a good wife." "She sure is," Bob replied, taking a sip, though it was clear his thoughts were elsewhere. "Bob," Dominic began, eyeing him carefully, "I wanted to say something." He took another drink. "Don't you think this Lance is the wrong match for your daughter?" "You know, brother," Bob finally replied, "after last night, I don't know what to think." "You mean, you saw it all?" Dominic looked at him, surprised. "You saw it too?" Bob's eyes widened in surprise. "I was there when it happened. Tyler beat me to it, though. I'm sure you'd have done the same." "What are you talking about, Dominic?" Bob shot up, clenching his fists. "What are you talking about?" Dominic looked bewildered. "We seem to be talking about different things. You go first." "All right," Bob began, sitting back down. "Last night, I couldn't sleep. Something was bothering me, and then I realized it was Lance. He drank way too much, and I've never seen him like that. I tossed and turned, then went to the window. And there, I saw Sue standing there, kissing our doctor. What am I supposed to think? What if someone else saw? It's disgraceful. I'll talk to her, set things straight. But I'm afraid." "Hold on, Bob," Dominic interrupted. "First, let me tell you what I saw." And he recounted the events of the previous night in the backyard and the shed. Bob clenched his fists at intervals, but he listened to the story to the end. "They're both fools," Bob finally declared. "One nearly committed a sin, and the other took advantage of her." "I don't think the doctor took advantage. I've been watching them for a while. The way they look at each other. At your birthday, he couldn't take his eyes off her, and she kept sneaking glances, blushing. No, this is mutual. So what are we supposed to do now? The wedding's coming up," Bob exclaimed in frustration. "We need to think this through." But they didn't have time. A hesitant cough came from the gate. Lance stood there, holding a bouquet of flowers. "You scoundrel!" Bob roared, lunging toward his future son-in-law. "Bob, don't!" Lance raised his hands in defense. "I came to apologize. I really don't know what got into me. It was the wine." Bob grabbed him by the collar. "No, no. I swear, I'll never drink again. I get it now. Please, can I talk to Sue?" But before Bob could respond, Sue appeared on the porch, looking worried. "Dad, what's going on?" "Your future husband's here to apologize," Bob said sarcastically. Sue walked over to the men. "Sue, please listen to me," Lance pleaded. She led him aside to hear him out. "Please forgive me. I don't know what came over me. I don't even usually drink. I promise it won't happen again." He held out a crumpled bouquet to her. "Look, I went out first thing this morning and got these. Will you forgive me?" Sue looked at her fiancé and realized she didn't love him. Whatever feelings she'd had for him recently were nothing compared to what she felt for Tyler. But she also knew she couldn't be with Tyler. There was too much at stake for her family. "All right. I'll forgive you. But on the condition that this was the first and last time." Lance quickly nodded. "And you won't ever try to force me into anything against my will." "Of course, my love." Lance pulled her into a hug and tried to kiss her. Sue reluctantly offered her lips. "Daughter, I know everything. About you, about Lance, and about Tyler." Sue turned away from the window and looked at her father in surprise. "Uncle Dominic told you? About Lance?" "I saw you with Tyler myself," Bob replied, watching his daughter's face carefully. He saw the sadness in her eyes and understood she was in love. "Sue, if you want to call off the wedding, I'll understand." "The people won't," she replied softly but firmly. "People?" Bob gently took her hand. "What matters is that you're happy." "Dad, I will be happy. Lance isn't a stranger to me. He's a good person. He just can't handle his alcohol, but he promised he won't drink again. And Tyler. Tyler is just a passing fancy. It'll go away once I'm married to Lance." "Are you sure?" "Yes." "Sue." "Dad," she cut him off. "Just imagine what would happen if I called it all off just days before the wedding. Our family would be disgraced. Lance's parents wouldn't let this go, and the whole town would turn against us." "Well, not the whole town," Bob tried to argue, though he knew she was probably right. "Dad," Sue placed her small hand over his large, rough one, "I'll marry Lance, and everything will be all right." Bob sighed heavily, wished her good night, and left the room. As soon as the door closed, Sue fell onto her bed and began to cry silently. "Tyler, this is for you." Carol stood in front of him, looking as polished as ever, holding a plate covered with a cloth. "What's this?" Tyler frowned. "I noticed you always have lunch here at the clinic, so I thought I'd treat you to a homemade pie," she said, smiling. "Why?" "Well, you're always eating those prepackaged meals. I thought something homemade would be better for you." Thanks. So, how about I put on the kettle, and we'll have tea together?" Carol offered brightly. Yes, go ahead," Tyler replied, barely paying attention, clearly distracted by other thoughts. Carol quickly left for the break room. "Tyler. Come, let's have a talk," Bob said, poking his head into the office. The two men left the clinic and walked outside. When Carol returned, she found only the plate of pie, left untouched on the desk. Bob couldn't shake the conversation he'd had with his daughter the night before. He understood she was doing the right thing, but he feared that this decision, so right in everyone's eyes, might bring her nothing but misery. After a sleepless night and struggling through half a day's work, he decided to go to the local clinic. Bob and Tyler walked over to a bench outside, and without any preamble, Bob shared his worries. "I know, Tyler, and I even sense that you care about my daughter. I get that it might just be infatuation, but I also can't bear the thought of her marrying Lance. Listen, Bob, I already asked Sue to reconsider her decision, but she's determined not to change anything, for your sake." "For our sake? We've made our life, Tyler. Even if everyone turned against us, Jolene and I would still have each other. Talk to her again, Tyler. You can even appeal to her feelings for you. I know you're a good man and won't take advantage of her. But what if I break her heart? What if this really is just a passing thing for me?" "A broken heart is better than a broken life," Bob replied firmly. Tyler nodded. He knew Bob was right, that if Sue went through with this marriage, she'd ruin her life. After a moment's thought, Tyler replied, "All right, I'll talk to her." Winter had arrived, and the house was buzzing with wedding preparations. Once again, Sue was gently pushed away from any tasks. "Rest, my dear," her mother smiled warmly. "Save those hands. They should be as beautiful as the ring your husband will place on your finger." Sue forced a smile. Seeking a bit of quiet, she slipped out to the garden and sat in the gazebo, lost in thought until the chill began to seep through her. She thought of that night with Tyler, his strong yet gentle embrace, his tender kisses. How she wished it was Tyler, not Lance, awaiting her at the altar. But, sadly, she'd realized it too late. "I knew I'd find you here." Tyler's familiar voice sounded behind her. Sue jumped up from the bench and found herself in his arms. They looked at each other for a brief, breathless moment before melting into a long, deep kiss. "You're the new guy?" A cheerful voice had made Tyler turn around, and in that moment, he fell. Standing before him was a captivating woman with sparkling eyes and an impish smile. "I'm Layla," she said, extending her hand. "First Lieutenant Johnson," Tyler replied. "Ha ha ha." Layla laughed. "And what's your first name, First Lieutenant Johnson?" Tyler, and he taking her hand. Layla was a sniper. Every time she went on a mission, Tyler could barely breathe until she returned, safe and sound. Their relationship moved fast. "Why hold back when we could die any moment?" she would whisper passionately, and Tyler couldn't agree more. They often dreamed of the future. Once their contracts ended, they would escape to a quiet town nestled deep in the woods, a place far removed from war, where they could live without fear, without the constant readiness to fight. Imagine us, sitting on a porch at sunset. And it's not a bloody sunset like here, but soft pink. Just peace, the sound of rustling grass and trees, Layla would say, and Tyler wholeheartedly agreed. He agreed with everything, as long as she was by his side. But then, just before their contracts ended, Layla was gone. Tyler stumbled out of the medical tent, exhausted. Since early morning, he'd been treating the wounded as the relentless battle raged on. Every soldier who came through the tent alive was a relief to him, especially when it wasn't Layla. By evening, reinforcements arrived along with helicopters to evacuate the wounded to the hospital. The surviving soldiers began loading the injured onto the helicopters. Tyler made his way to those he could no longer help. As he approached the row of fallen soldiers lying on the ground, he staggered. Among them was Layla. He dropped to his knees by her body, silently breaking down. His world shattered. Someone came, lifted him, and led him back to the tent. There, they gave him a sedative, and he drifted into a heavy, dreamless sleep. When he awoke, Layla was already gone. A nurse saw him stirring and ran to get the commander. Tyler, How are you? I'm fine, just a bit of a headache. Well, that's to be expected, the captain replied with a sympathetic smile. Maybe you should take a leave? Why? My contract's almost up. I'm honestly fine. The captain patted his shoulder and left. Tyler returned to his duties the next day. The battles continued, but he was no longer afraid. He felt nothing but emptiness. After his service, he visited Layla's grave, sat silently for a while, and left without looking back. He didn't know what to do next. He was offered a new contract and a position in a city hospital, but none of it felt right. One day, he was wandering aimlessly through the streets when he came across an old woman selling vegetables. Take some, dear. Fresh from the countryside, she said. He remembered his conversations with Layla, her dream of a quiet life in a small town. Tyler smiled, handed the woman a few bills, and walked quickly home. You forgot your vegetables, she called after him, but he didn't hear. His decision was made. He found a town online that matched what he was looking for and bought a one-way ticket. His encounter with Sue had turned his world upside down, making him feel alive again. But now Tyler felt the familiar shadow of loss approaching. His talk with Sue's father had confirmed that the possibility of losing her was very real. He wasn't sure if she'd listen to him and call off the wedding, but he also doubted his own feelings. Could he really give her what she deserved? Could he offer anything to replace the life she'd planned? And what if his feelings were just a passing attraction, an attempt to move on from his grief, to feel alive again? Tyler paced through his house, restless, until finally, without realizing what he was doing, he dressed and went outside. His feet carried him automatically, almost instinctively, to the place where he'd kissed her for the first time, the garden. There, on the bench, sat Sue. I knew I'd find you here, he said, his voice barely a whisper. They fell into each other's arms, kissing as if they could never stop. In that moment, all of Tyler's doubts about their future vanished. He knew, without a doubt, that he needed her. Sue. Call off the wedding. Marry me instead, he said, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. Tyler, it's too late. Everything is already decided. There's no turning back now, Sue said, her gaze lingering on his face, as if trying to commit it to memory. We realized this too late. But your parents want you to be happy. I want you to be happy. They don't want to think about the consequences, even though they understand them. But there will be consequences. I can't be the reason for their unhappiness. Sue fell silent and sat down on the bench. Tyler sat beside her, feeling the weight of the loss approaching. They would meet again, exchange words here and there, but they could never truly be together. Sue, Tyler said softly, looking at her, I want you to know, you can always count on me. Always. I'll be there whenever you need me. Do you understand? Sue nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Thank you, Tyler. I should go. Tyler watched as she walked away down the path toward her house. That was it. It turned out you could lose the one you loved without a war. Bob and Dominic scanned the crowd of guests, a shared anxiety in their eyes. Both were worried about one thing, Tyler showing up. Sue was visibly tense, her hands trembling, and her gaze darting around the guests. Tyler, despite his failed attempts to persuade her to call off the wedding, was nowhere to be seen. Bob was certain that if he had shown up, the wedding would have been ruined. And that couldn't be allowed to happen. But the doctor didn't appear. Jolene, with Mrs. Perkins' help, had given Sue a sedative, and her hands had finally stopped shaking. Her gaze, now dull, stayed fixed downward. The guests assumed the bride was shy and teased her gently. Lance, on the other hand, was cheerful, talkative, answering everyone's questions with enthusiasm. By nightfall, Sue felt exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. Lance, let's leave, she said to her new husband. Can't wait to be alone with your loving husband, eh? Lance's voice was thankfully lost in the din of the guests, sparing Sue from further embarrassment. Attention, everyone, he called, standing and tapping his glass. After a short speech thanking everyone for coming to celebrate their wedding, he announced that he and his wife would be leaving. The guests cheered and wished them a happy wedding night. Grabbing a bottle from the table, Lance took Sue's hand, and they left. Tonight, they would spend their first night in the house that Lance's parents had gifted them. On the way, Lance stopped several times to drink from the bottle. "Lance, you promised you wouldn't drink," Sue said flatly. In truth, she didn't care anymore. "But it's a celebration," Lance exclaimed, laughing. "Our celebration. Wait. I need to stop by my house. I forgot my robe." An idea sparked in Sue's mind. "What do you need a robe for tonight?" Lance pulled her close, kissing her. "I'm telling you, you won't need it." "Not tonight, but what about tomorrow?" Sue replied calmly. "I can't wear my wedding dress around the house tomorrow, can I?" "You can wear nothing at all, as far as I'm concerned. What if one of our parents drops by to check on us or offer help?" "Fine, let's go get your robe," Lance relented. Along with the robe, Sue also took a small bottle of the sedative her mother had given her earlier in the day. Once she arrived at her new home, she seized a moment to pour some of the sedative into Lance's bottle of liquor. She hoped the combination would have a strong enough effect to put him to sleep, allowing her to delay the intimacy with a man she didn't love. "Come on, hurry up and get undressed." Lance, already swaying, stripped off his shirt and pants. "Need help?" He tried to stand and come over to her, but his legs were no longer cooperating. No, I can manage." "Just a second," Sue said, fumbling with the fastenings of her dress as she kept glancing at him, waiting for the sedative to take effect. Unable to wait, Lance reached for the bottle again, taking a huge gulp before promptly collapsing onto the bed and beginning to snore. Sue slowly finished undressing, folding her wedding dress carefully over a chair. She put on her robe, sat down on the edge of the bed, and watched her husband sleep the deep, drunken sleep of the sedated. After a moment's thought, she threw on her coat and slipped outside. Tyler had been restless all day, torn between wanting to attend the wedding and dreading what he might do if he did. He kept putting his suit on, only to take it off again and hang it back in the closet. Finally, he decided to keep himself busy by cleaning. By evening, his house sparkled. He grabbed a pack of cigarettes and went out onto the porch. The night promised to be cold, with stars scattered across the sky. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of celebration, music, loud voices, someone singing. During his cleaning, Tyler had come across a cabinet full of books left by the previous owners. He decided he'd spend his evening with one of them. Just as he was about to sit down, there was a soft knock at the door. Who could be here so late? Tyler went to answer it, and there she was, Sue. Quickly, he pulled her inside. "What happened? Did someone hurt you?" "Was it Lance?" he asked, looking her over anxiously. "No," she laughed. "Lance is fast asleep. Drunk. Very drunk. I just really wanted to see you." Tyler paused, searching her face, then took her hands, guided her to the table, and helped her into a chair. Without a word, he went to put the kettle on. Meanwhile, Sue took off her coat and looked around. It was probably just a bachelor's place, but to her, it felt like the best place on earth. They drank tea, talking about everything under the sun, but their eyes spoke a different language. After a while, Sue rose to leave. Tyler pulled her into his arms, and they began kissing, unable to stop. "Tyler, I came here to tell you," she tried to speak between kisses, but Tyler, afraid of what she might say, kissed her harder, silencing her. "Tyler," she pushed back, looking into his eyes. "Sorry." "I'm listening," he said, holding her on his lap. "Tyler, I want my first time to be with someone I love," she said, her cheeks flushing. "So, I take it that's not Lance?" Tyler replied. "Tyler, I want it to be you," Sue blushed even deeper. "You're using me? For what? To get back at your husband for breaking his promise?" "No." She leapt up. "Sorry. I didn't think it through." I just wanted my first time to be with you. She turned to run, but Tyler caught her, pulling her close. It was madness, but if he regretted it tomorrow, he didn't care. Tonight was all that mattered. Later, Sue lay in bed, quietly crying. It had been 2 hours since she'd returned from Tyler's. Lance was still asleep, snoring loudly. If only he knew what his wife had done on their wedding night. Just thinking of it made Sue's cheeks burn, her whole body tremble. A sleepless night and tear-streaked cheeks finally led her to exhaustion, and she fell asleep. They were awakened by loud knocking at the door. Sue jolted up, and Lance sat up in bed, disoriented. "I'll get it," he said, pulling on his pants and heading for the door. "Hey, newlyweds. Still sleeping? What did you do all night?" came a booming laugh from outside. Sue couldn't hear Lance's reply. She threw on her robe, washed up, and went to greet the guests in the living room. Around the large round table sat all the relatives of the newlywed couple, with Lance at the head. Jolene and Lance's mother bustled around, preparing food. "We're going to have some barbecue," her mother said, rushing over. "And you should change. Put on something nice, and give your husband a fresh shirt." Sue called Lance, who was still sitting at the table in just his pants, already drinking, and led him away to change. When they returned, the table was fully set. "Sue," Lance leaned over and whispered in her ear, "everything okay? I mean, the night." Sue blushed, and Lance took it as a good sign, grinning. "Don't worry, it only gets better. The first time isn't always great, but soon, you'll be begging for more." Her face flushed bright red, and she sprang up, rushing to the kitchen as though she'd just remembered something. For nearly a week, Lance celebrated his wedding. First with family, then friends, then co-workers. All the while, Sue was busy settling into the house, arranging dishes, hanging curtains, spreading rugs, making it feel like a home. She didn't mind Lance's drinking. She was actually relieved he'd come home and fall straight to sleep without bothering her. Every night before bed, she thought of Tyler and their brief but intense love. She hadn't seen him since that night, and she'd hardly left the house. Finally, Lance finished his week-long celebrations and returned to everyday life. That first night together became the worst of Sue's life. Lance had no interest in making it enjoyable for her, only in showing off what he could do. Every night after was the same. At first, Sue would slip away to cry, but soon, she stopped caring. Lance, puzzled by her lack of enthusiasm, eventually dismissed it, deciding she was just different in that way. But he continued to fulfill what he saw as his marital duty. After all, Sue was supposed to start having children soon, just as any respectable wife should. Month after month passed, yet Sue didn't become pregnant. "What kind of woman did I end up with?" Lance exclaimed one night. "She can't even give her husband affection or bear children. You need to see a doctor. You're defective." "She seems fine at first glance," Mrs. Perkins said, eyeing the disinterested Sue, then turning to Lance, "but if it'll calm your nerves, take her to the city to be checked out. You could even check yourself, just in case." "Why me?" Lance replied, surprised. "I'm perfectly healthy in every way." In the city clinic, they found nothing wrong with Sue. "She's fully healthy and capable of bearing children," the smiling doctor concluded. "Lance, perhaps you might consider getting tested too?" "Why? I'm in perfect health." A year had passed. Sue had grown accustomed to her somewhat unhappy married life. It wasn't that Lance treated her poorly. He did all the man's work around the house, never withheld money from her, though she rarely asked for anything, and he was always polite. But there was no love, no tenderness. Once, she tried to bring it up, mentioning how couples were in romantic movies. Lance had just laughed. "What? A man's gotta be a man. Romance isn't a guy's thing. You want love? Let's head to bed." Sometimes, Sue would run into Tyler. They would exchange greetings and a few meaningless words, but their eyes held a different conversation altogether. "If only you knew how much I miss you. How I long to hold you and never let go. How foolish I was not to listen to you, to call off the wedding. How I wish I could leave everything behind and just be with you. But they never spoke these thoughts aloud. And after a brief meeting, each would go their separate ways. One evening, Lance was making his way home from work. The day had started with a thaw, but by evening, the temperature had dropped, turning the road into ice. His feet slipped, and despite his best efforts to keep his balance, he fell. A sharp pain shot through his leg, and he couldn't stand on his own. Luckily, a neighbor happened to be passing by on his way home. "Lance, what are you doing lying here?" the neighbor asked with a laugh, stopping beside him. "Damn ice. I think I twisted my ankle." "Come on, let's get you home," the neighbor said, helping Lance up. Leaning on him, Lance hobbled back to the house on one leg. "Lance, you should have gone to the doctor." Sue gasped when she saw him. "What if it's broken?" "Broken? Nonsense," Lance said, wincing as he waved her off. "I'm a strong man. I just need a beer for my health." "Hey, neighbor, what about you?" The neighbor, smiling broadly, shrugged off his coat and followed Lance to the kitchen. Sue set the table for the two of them, then left for the bedroom. By morning, Lance's leg was swollen and red, and he couldn't move it at all. Alarmed, Sue ran to get her father, and together they took Lance to the hospital. Carol saw an expression on the doctor's face that she had never seen before. Tyler, always so calm and controlled, seemed rattled. He was usually so stoic, even when Carol tried accidentally brushing up against him or showing just a bit too much skin. With his patients, he was kind and professional, and everyone liked him. Thanks to Tyler, the regional administration had started noticing their small hospital. His requests for equipment, medicine, and additional funding were increasingly granted. Soon, the hospital would even have its own ambulance. Tyler took all of this in stride, as if it were completely normal. Nothing seemed capable of unsettling him. So when the disheveled wife of the new farm manager burst into his office, Carol couldn't believe her eyes. The usually composed and unflappable Tyler jumped up from his chair and rushed to the woman's side. "Sue, what happened?" Carol could have sworn the doctor was on the verge of panic. "Tyler," Sue noticed the nurse and quickly tried to keep her tone neutral. "Lance hurt his leg." "Where is he?" Tyler seemed to regain his composure, remembering they weren't alone. In the car, Sue gestured toward the door. "We couldn't get him here ourselves. I think he's unconscious." Tyler grabbed his coat, instructed Carol to prepare the procedure room, and dashed outside. Lance was indeed unconscious. With the help of a few men who were waiting in the lobby, Tyler and Bob managed to carry Lance to the procedure room. "You got him here just in time," Tyler said after an hour, joining Sue and Bob in the waiting area. "Lance has a torn ligament, and I strongly recommend keeping him here for now." "But where would he stay?" Sue asked, surprised. "We've converted some rooms into wards. Sometimes patients need to stay under observation," Tyler explained. "The nurses and I take turns keeping watch, so there's no need to worry. The only inconvenience is that there's no kitchen at the hospital, so—" Yes, I understand." Sue nodded quickly. "I'll bring him meals." "How are you?" Sue asked Tyler, having just come from her husband's room. Tyler met her in the hall. "I'm fine." They walked in silence down the corridor toward the exit. The hospital was quiet. Everyone, patients and staff, had long since gone for the day. "Sue," Tyler stopped her at the door, "I regret so much that I couldn't talk you out of the marriage." "It's fine, Tyler. You wouldn't have succeeded anyway. Back then, I truly believed I was doing the right thing. And now?" Sue looked away, her gaze fixed on the wall as she fought back tears. Without a word, Tyler stepped closer and held her, gently kissing her. Her tears spilled over, and she clung to him. He kissed them away, not missing her lips. They didn't know how long they stayed like that, but finally, as her tears subsided, Sue sighed heavily and whispered, "I have to go." Tyler watched her leave, feeling that he couldn't bear another encounter like this. If it came to it, he would have to steal her away and take her far, far from here. When Lance opened his eyes, he was shocked to see a blonde angel leaning over him, with full lips and a well-formed chest peeking through the neckline of her white cloth. What on earth did that doctor give me, he wondered, his mind racing. Whatever it is, I'd better enjoy this while it lasts. Good morning, the angel smiled. Did you sleep well? Better ask me how it feels to wake up, Lance replied with a shaky voice. I've never had a morning this good. Finally coming to his senses, he realized he was in a hospital room, and the angel was actually just a nurse. Wonderful. Now, I'll give you your injection and change your dressing, Carol said, flashing him an alluring smile, aware of the effect her appearance was having. Lance, assuming her smile was meant just for him, grinned back. Sue entered the room just as Carol was finishing up the bandage. She waited for Carol to leave, then unpacked the breakfast she'd brought for her husband. But Lance, still daydreaming about the nurse, didn't notice the sadness in his wife's eyes. He ate the meal with unusual enthusiasm and, for the first time, even thanked her. Lost in her own thoughts, Sue barely noticed. After exchanging a few words about his recovery, she left, leaving him in a state of excitement from his earlier encounter, something she also failed to see. Carol reapplied her lipstick and gave herself a critical look in the mirror. Tonight was her shift, and she intended to solidify her progress in charming the new farm manager. Lance hadn't been able to take his eyes off her, and she saw desire there. At first, it amused her, but then she began to see possibilities. Winning Tyler over had gone nowhere, but Lance seemed like a much easier and potentially more rewarding target. Lance came from a good, well-off family. His father had arranged for him to take his own managerial position upon retirement. Lance's older brother worked in the local administration, in a fairly high position, and his uncle was the town chairman. Lance was exactly the kind of worthy candidate an ambitious nurse like Carol needed. The fact that he was already married didn't bother her one bit. She knew she'd have to tread carefully, but act quickly. She'd already wasted 2 years. Carol entered Lance's room, noticing the way his eyes lit up when he saw her. All right, Lance, time for your evening injection, she said, licking her lips in a seemingly casual way. She noticed his breath quicken. Carol, he caught her hand just as she was finishing. Would you stay with me? Just for a bit? I'm here all alone, and I'm going crazy from the silence. Carol feigned a moment of hesitation before smiling and saying, All right, why not? You're my only patient right now, and I can fill out your chart later. She sat on the edge of his bed, and they started talking. Lance complained about how distant and cold his wife was, while Carol spoke of her unfulfilled need to care for someone. My first husband didn't appreciate my care or my loyalty, she said. I did everything to make him happy, and it was like he didn't even see me. How could anyone ignore a woman like you? Lance said, barely holding back his admiration. If I had a wife like you, I'd treat her like a queen. They talked late into the night, until Carol finally pretended to be shocked at the time, saying she'd kept him up too long. Lance insisted she was no bother at all and that he could stay up all night just looking at her, but she decided she'd done enough for now. The fish was hooked. All that remained was to reel him in, but not tonight. Let him simmer a bit. All right, Lance, I think it's time to discharge you, Tyler said, jotting down notes in Lance's chart. What? Already? Lance's face fell. Today was Carol's shift, and he'd been looking forward to spending more time with her, maybe even the whole night. Yes. Is there a problem? Tyler gave him a puzzled look. You've completed your course of injections, and I'm sure you can manage the dressings on your own. But what if I'm not fully healed? Lance's tone was anxious. What if the pain comes back without the injections? Tyler studied him carefully. Was he really so worried about his recovery that he wanted to stay in the hospital longer? That was unlike him. Although. All right, let's monitor you for a few more days, Tyler said, adding more notes to the chart. We'll see how you respond without the injections. Lance broke into a smile. Later that day, he planned to talk to his father, knowing he could rely on him for support. "Your husband decided to stay on for a few more days," Tyler informed Sue as she peeked into his office. The nurse was still there, so his tone was strictly professional. "Why?" she asked. "He wants to monitor his progress without injections, just to be cautious." Tyler watched with a trace of tenderness as the tension left Sue's face. She seemed relieved by this unexpected extension of her freedom. "Of course, if it's necessary," Sue said, glancing gratefully at Tyler. Carol, meanwhile, was lost in her own thoughts about the evening ahead. Lance had been hesitant to make a move, so she was already planning how to nudge things along. Tyler's decision to extend Lance's stay surely came at Lance's request, she reasoned. It was a good sign. The fish had taken the bait and was ready to bite. That evening, Sue sat alone in her parents' kitchen, absently stirring a now-cold cup of tea. "Sue, sometimes I think you're not very happy in your marriage," Jolene said, sitting down next to her daughter and studying her distant expression. Bob started to speak, but Sue's look silenced him. "It's fine, Mom," Sue murmured, setting down her spoon and taking a sip. "Lance just really wants kids, and they haven't happened." "Well, maybe you should go to the city hospital," Jolene suggested, glancing worriedly at Bob. "We already did." "Everything's fine with me," Sue sighed. "I think I'll go out for a walk." On the porch, her father quietly caught up with her, and they walked in silence until they were far enough from the house. Finally, Bob spoke. "Leave him, Sue. I can see that you're unhappy with him. Just leave." "Dad, how can I? Where would I go? What would people say?" "You can come home. This is your home. And to hell with what people say. This is your life." "I'll think about it, Dad." "You go back, Mom will miss you," Sue said, without slowing down. Bob lingered for a moment, watching her walk off, then sighed heavily and turned back. Carol finished buttoning up her dress, adjusting her hair, and glanced over at Lance. "You were just incredible," she cooed, laying the flattery on thick. Lance almost blushed, squirming on the hospital bed. "Will I see you again?" he stammered, a little awkward. "Of course, I'll be back for your dressing change." "I didn't mean that," Lance tried. With a dramatic sigh, Carol perched on the edge of his bed, taking his hand and pressing it to her chest. "Lance, you're a married man, it's improper, we've already crossed the line." "So what?" he exclaimed, the feel of her against his hand driving him crazy. He'd do anything to repeat last night. It felt so right to be together. "My wife's cold as ice. If I'd known what marriage would be like, I wouldn't have done it. And she can't even give me a child. You're everything she isn't. I want to be with you." "But we'll need to be very careful, my dear," Carol replied, releasing his hand and rising. "It's nearly morning, and I still need to get ready for the day." Just before stepping out, she blew him a kiss, which he eagerly returned. Alone, Lance basked in the memory of the night, feeling as if he'd found everything he'd been missing. Carol stood touching up her makeup in front of a mirror in the office when Tyler walked in. She quickly stepped away, but he hardly noticed, heading straight to his desk and loading documents into a large folder. "Carol, I've been called to the city for some equipment arrangements for the lab. You're in charge today," he informed her. "If anything serious comes up, call Mrs. Perkins, she'll handle it. I'll try to stop by here in the evening." "Understood, Tyler," Carol replied, almost relieved. After a sleepless night, she desperately needed rest. When Lance was set to be discharged from the hospital, Sue decided to freshen up their home with new curtains and a tablecloth. She felt a need to make things right with him, to compensate, in some way, for the lack of love she felt. She couldn't shake the feeling that he had sensed it, his gaze had been strange lately. Early that morning, she stood at the bus stop. The bus was late, and she wasn't alone, several others waited too. Finally, they saw the bus approaching in the distance. Just then, they noticed someone running toward the stop, clearly trying to catch it. The bus arrived, and Sue got on with the others. The driver patiently waited for the running man to catch up. "Sorry," Tyler said breathlessly, boarding the bus. As the bus pulled away, Tyler scanned for an open seat. Spotting Sue sitting alone, he headed straight for her. She couldn't believe it. Was he really going to sit with her, here, in front of everyone? Her cheeks turned red, but he continued toward her and, sure enough, took the seat beside her. "Good morning, Sue." "Good morning, Tyler," she replied, glancing nervously around the bus, but nobody seemed to notice them. "Heading out on errands?" she asked. "For errands," Tyler smiled, and just then, Sue felt his hand gently take hers. Startled, she looked at him, but his eyes held a soft warmth, and he gave her hand a light, reassuring squeeze. "I'm trying to get a lab set up here," he explained. "I'm tired of having to send samples all the way to the city every time." They chatted casually the whole trip, sticking to safe topics, but their eyes and the touch of their hands spoke of something deeper, something unspoken. Sue stood in the fabric shop, fingering different curtain materials. She couldn't stop thinking about the morning ride with Tyler. He held her hand the entire way. At first, the touch had made her nervous, but within minutes, it felt so natural. She felt loved, protected. As they left the bus, he'd asked her casually, "Taking the bus back tonight?" "I think so." "Lots to do," she replied, wondering, what things? Then she realized she only wanted to be with him again. "Have you decided on something?" the shop assistant asked, pulling Sue from her thoughts. "Oh, yes, this one," she said, pointing to the first fabric she saw. She left the shop with her arms full of packages, walking slowly, stopping often to shift the weight. Carrying so much, there was no way she'd be able to wait until evening for the bus back with Tyler. Just then, someone took the packages from her. "Why'd you carry all this alone?" a familiar voice asked. "I just got carried away," she said, barely hiding her happiness at seeing him. "And what about you? What brings you here?" "I finished my work early too." "That's great." Sue was relieved to be beside Tyler and freed from the weight of her packages. They returned to town that afternoon, strolling together from the bus stop as Tyler shared funny stories. When they reached her house, Sue took a deep breath and asked, "Would you like to come in for tea?" She blushed. "Gladly. I haven't eaten since morning, and if I go back to work now, I'll be starving." "How terrible!" Sue gasped. "Come on, I'll make you lunch." At home, she quickly changed and went to warm up the food. Tyler washed his hands and sat, watching her with warmth. When she placed a steaming bowl of soup in front of him, he unexpectedly pulled her onto his lap and kissed her passionately. Sue, as if waiting for this, wrapped her arms around him, returning his kisses. Lifting her in his arms, Tyler carried her to the bedroom. Only now did they realize how much they'd missed each other, how much they'd dreamed of and wanted each other. Sue didn't care what she would tell herself later. Right now, nothing else mattered. "I love you," Tyler said, kissing her hands. "Be with me." "Divorce, Lance." "I'm scared." "Of what?" "People's opinions?" "Forget about them. I won't let anyone look down on you. I'll marry you as soon as you're free." "All right, my love. But I need time. Just don't take too long, or I might take matters into my own hands." They kissed by the door for a long time, then Tyler left. Sue went to the kitchen, intending to drink tea and process Tyler's words. The untouched bowl of soup sat on the table. "When are they letting you out?" Sue asked Lance seriously. His injections had been stopped days ago, yet he was still in the hospital. "Tomorrow," Tyler said, entering the room. "You're not ready to go back to work yet, but you also don't need to stay here any longer." But Lance started to object, but Tyler interrupted him. "Your legs healed up well. I'll prescribe you a painkiller, just in case, but I don't think you'll need it. Sue, please come by later to pick up the prescription." What kind of doctor is this? Lance fumed. What if I have a relapse? A relapse? Sue said wearily. Besides, you will rest better at home. I'll pick up the prescription from the doctor and get the medicine tomorrow. She rose from her chair, said goodbye, and left the room. Lance felt panic rising. How would he meet with Carol now? He'd grown so accustomed to their encounters. Just thinking of her made his head spin and his pulse quicken. As soon as Sue entered the procedure room, she found herself in Tyler's arms. His kisses left her breathless, and every inch of her longed for more. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her back, and she pulled away, smoothing her hair quickly. Grabbing the prescription slip from the table, she darted out of the room. She crossed paths with the nurse in the hallway, who gave her a brief look and greeted her with a polite good evening before entering the procedure room. Carol? Is something wrong? Tyler asked, surprised. No, Tyler. I just wanted to ask if I could take over your shift tonight. Oh? Why's that? Well, I could really use the extra pay. And they pay double for overnight shifts, she shrugged, but there was a hint of anticipation in her eyes. Is everything okay financially? Tyler asked with genuine concern. Oh, yes. Nothing major. I just saw something I wanted to buy, a little luxury, she said with a flirty smile. But only if it's all right with you. Yes, of course. Go ahead, Tyler replied. I'm just finishing up my last patient's file here, then I'm out. Thank you, Tyler. Carol flashed a smile. Once he left, she adjusted her hair, undid an extra button on her uniform, and walked over to Lance's room. Lance, why are you so late? Sue asked, shuffling around the kitchen, preparing a late dinner for her husband. Just backed up with work, Lance replied, hanging up his coat and washing his hands before sitting down. Everything I do now has to be documented, and I have to stay late to finish it up. Anyway, why do you look so pale? I don't know. Just haven't been feeling my best lately, Sue admitted. Well, don't worry about waiting up for me anymore. I might be working late a lot now. I'll heat up my own food if I need to, Lance said, surprisingly generous. Really? Sue asked, raising an eyebrow. Unlike her father, Lance was usually firm on having his wife serve his dinner no matter the hour. Yeah, he shrugged. You have to get up, and if you're waiting for me every night, you'll run yourself ragged. Just leave it ready, and I'll take care of it. All right then, she replied, a bit taken aback. I guess I'll go to bed. Go on, he waved her off. Yet she barely drifted off before Lance joined her in bed and insisted on his marital rights. Carol stretched contentedly in bed, remembering how passionate Lance had been the night before. Their secret meetings had begun the moment Tyler announced Lance's discharge from the hospital. That evening, she had visited him under the pretense of saying goodbye, putting on a sorrowful expression and waiting to see how he would respond. She needed to gauge his interest, to decide if this was just a passing affair for him or something that required a more strategic approach. I have to see you again, he'd murmured, kissing her neck. I can't stop thinking about you. We need a plan. Pleased, Carol suggested an idea. Well, I do have keys to the clinic. We could meet here, after hours. Seriously, he'd brightened. You're brilliant. A few days after his discharge, they met up for the first time. Lance told his wife he was off to see friends, but as soon as night fell, he hurried over to the hospital. Their rendezvous became regular. Occasionally, they even managed to meet during the day. Carol knew she had Lance hooked, but she was growing impatient, waiting for him to make a move and leave his wife. However, Lance didn't seem to be considering it seriously. He often compared her to Sue, saying how Sue wasn't as beautiful, as passionate, or as exciting. Carol would listen sympathetically, reassuring him that she could fulfill all the things he felt were lacking in his marriage. Lance eagerly accepted her attentions. Tired of the secrecy, Carol started thinking about how to nudge Lance toward divorce. She began going over all the flaws in Sue that Lance had mentioned, hoping to find the right argument to sway him. She dresses too plainly, doesn't wear makeup, is always busy with chores, never takes much initiative in the bedroom, spends too much time with her parents, and, worst of all, hasn't given him a child. It was the last complaint that sparked an idea in Carol's mind. She realized that, to push Lance towards something permanent, she might need to give him exactly what he wanted, an heir. Stop. A baby. Carol realized she needed to get pregnant by Lance to play on his desire to be a father. Carol didn't love the idea. The thought of diapers and midnight feedings didn't thrill her, but her desire to marry Lance won out. Decision made. All she had to do now was stop taking her birth control. Sue was working in the garden when someone called her name. She straightened her aching back to see who it was, Tyler. She knew why he'd come. "Take a break, you're looking pale," Tyler said, sitting down on a bench near the fence and nodding for her to join him. Sue sat down gratefully, realizing just how tired she felt. "Sue, you know why I'm here. What are you waiting for? Why keep torturing both of us? Are you scared? Let's talk to everyone together." "No, no," Sue said quickly, a flash of panic in her voice. "I'll handle it myself. Just give me a little more time." "How much more time?" he asked gently. "I don't know, but I'll talk to Lance soon." Sue's stomach churned with nerves. "What's wrong?" "Sue, you look pale," Tyler said, his concern deepening. "Are you feeling sick? Don't stay quiet, tell me." He felt her forehead and checked her pulse. "You've got something going on. Let's go to Mrs. Perkins," he said firmly. Sue tried to protest, but Tyler insisted, saying he'd carry her there himself if she didn't agree. She relented. "Dearie, you do look pale," Mrs. Perkins said, shaking her head. "Tyler, wait outside, please. Beth, take a blood sample." A few minutes later, the nurse emerged with a vial of Sue's blood and handed it to Tyler. Mrs. Perkins said to get these results back as quickly as possible. Tyler dashed to the lab. Just as I thought," Mrs. Perkins said with a knowing smile. "Well, what's wrong?" Sue and Tyler asked in unison. "You, dear, have a condition common among married women. You are pregnant. Congratulations." Sue gently touched her slightly rounded belly and smiled. Soon, she wouldn't be able to hide her secret anymore. Only Mrs. Perkins and Tyler knew about her pregnancy. While it was easy enough to ask Mrs. Perkins to keep quiet, Tyler had been a different story. He was outraged when Sue told him that a divorce was out of the question now. "Can't you see that this is my child?" he argued. "You and Lance tried for 2 years without a baby, and he wanted one badly. Why do you think it's his? And why are you so sure it's yours?" Tyler couldn't answer that. He only had a strong feeling. "All right. Let's do a test. If the child is Lance's, I'll leave you alone and never bother you again." But when she learned about the risks of prenatal paternity tests, Sue flatly refused. After a bit of back and forth, they agreed to wait until the child was born. Sue checked the time. Lance was late again. Just as she was about to head to bed, the door crashed open, and Lance stumbled in, clearly drunk. "Sue," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "You're asleep again? Why aren't you up waiting for your husband to come home? Set the table, now." Sue silently warmed up his dinner, set it on the table, and started to head to bed. "Where do you think you're going?" Lance growled. "You're supposed to sit here and keep me company." "Lance, I'm exhausted and need to sleep." "Exhausted from what?" "You sit at home all day, doing nothing. You think making a pot of soup is enough?" "I don't want to talk to you in this state," Sue said firmly, heading toward the kitchen door. "You're drunk." "So what? I'm a man. I work hard and I'm tired. Don't I have a right to a drink after work?" he yelled after her. Sue had made it to the bedroom and was about to lie down when Lance stormed in, roughly shoving her so that she fell onto the bed. He lunged, tearing at her clothes. "Wait! You haven't fulfilled your wifely duties yet," he sneered. Sue fought back, which only enraged him more. Unable to control his anger, he hit her, again and again. Stunned, more from shock than pain, she finally went still as tears streamed from her eyes. This sobered Lance somewhat, and he backed away from her, horrified. Sue scrambled up and fled. Lance sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, making no attempt to follow her. Sue ran blindly, tears blurring her vision, not knowing where she was going. Strong arms caught her and held her tightly. The familiar smell of tobacco and hay told her it was her father. "Sue! Sue! What happened?" He shook her shoulders gently, but she was too shaken to respond. Wrapping an arm around her, Bob led her toward home. Jolene was in the kitchen. After dinner, she and Bob had stayed up talking over tea about household matters. He'd gone outside to smoke and take a walk along the street. Just as he was about to turn back, he saw someone running toward him. When he looked closer, he realized it was his daughter. "My God, Sue, what happened?" Jolene cried, running to her daughter. Seeing her swollen lips and bruises, she rushed to get the first aid kit. "Who did this?" Bob's fists clenched. "Lance?" "Sue, answer me, or I'm going over there to find out myself." Sue nodded, and fresh tears filled her eyes. Bob grabbed his rifle and was about to head out the door when Jolene blocked his way. "What are you thinking? Have you lost your mind? You want to end up in jail over that idiot?" "Dad, please don't go." "He's drunk, he won't understand anything," Sue pleaded, supporting her mother. Bob looked from one woman to the other, then sighed heavily, going back to the kitchen. He sat down, his rifle by his side, and said gruffly, "Start talking." While Sue recounted everything that had happened, Jolene quietly took the rifle from her husband and put it away. "That scoundrel!" Bob slapped his knee angrily. "Here's what we're going to do. You're moving back here with us, and you're filing for divorce. I'm not letting you go back to that brute ever again." I can't," Sue whispered. "Why not?" Bob demanded, his frustration rising again. "I'm pregnant," she said softly. "Well, that's wonderful news," Jolene exclaimed, rushing to her daughter's side. "And all the more reason to leave that man before he really hurts you." "But how can I raise a child without a father?" Sue felt a sense of relief knowing her parents were on her side, ready to protect her. "Better no father than a violent one," Bob declared, pounding his fist on the table. "He'll have the best grandpa in the world," Jolene added, managing a tearful smile as she wiped her eyes. After giving Sue a cup of tea to calm her nerves, Jolene led her to the spare room to rest. Then she returned to the kitchen, where Bob was sitting, lost in thought. "Well, looks like we're officially getting old. We're going to be grandparents soon," Jolene said with a dreamy smile. "You'll be the youngest, most beautiful grandma there ever was," Bob chuckled, pulling her into a hug. "Now, let's get some sleep. We've got a lot to handle starting tomorrow." Arm in arm, they walked to their room, pausing to peek in on Sue, who was sleeping fitfully, clutching her belly. "You know," Bob whispered to his wife, "something tells me that this child won't grow up without a father." "Why do you say that?" Jolene asked, surprised. Bob wrapped his arms around his wife again and gently guided her toward their bedroom. Once inside, he sat her down and began to tell her everything he had been keeping to himself about their daughter and the doctor. Lance awoke with a pounding headache and a feeling of dread. He could remember the start of the evening, but after that, everything was a blur. Yesterday, as planned, Carol came to see him at work. They had stopped meeting at the hospital. With summer's arrival, it stayed light out much later, and the hospital was nearly in the town center, where locals, especially young people, gathered in the evenings to socialize and unwind. Without much thought, the lovers decided to meet at the farm, in Lance's office. There were two ways to reach the farm, a main central road for cars and farm workers, and a small winding path hidden by dense bushes, offering a discreet route. Carol used this path whenever she visited her lover. That evening, Carol had arrived with a mysterious smile, teasingly ignoring his questions until she finally said, "Honey, we're going to have a baby." Lance was struck silent, staring at her as his emotions scrambled to catch up. Carol watched, savoring his shock as he stumbled over his words. How can there be a baby?" he finally managed. "I mean, where did that come from?" "Oh, don't tell me you don't know where babies come from," Carol teased, batting her lashes. "I know that, it's just Sue and I have been trying for 2 years, and then, just like that." "Women get pregnant when they want to," Carol replied smoothly, her tone sweet. "I've wanted your baby since the day we met." She paused, glancing at Lance, who was still dumbfounded. "Are you not happy about it?" "Maybe I shouldn't have told you," she said, feigning disappointment. "What? No, of course you should have," Lance said, growing animated. "I'd almost given up on ever being a dad, and then, this. I'm thrilled, really. I just didn't expect it." "Well," Carol replied, leaning in with a knowing smile, "then you have some decisions to make." "What?" "Oh, yes. Of course, you should definitely keep the baby." "I meant more about how you'll be a father," she murmured, her voice low and suggestive. "I won't raise our child with a father who just drops by on weekends. I don't want to have to explain to my son or daughter why their father lives with someone else." Lance knew exactly what she meant, and he realized she was right. In his heart, he wanted to be with her. For a moment, he imagined coming home to Carol and being greeted by his beautiful wife and their chubby-cheeked son. It would have been perfect if not for one complication. Carol was a divorced woman, and everyone in town knew it. While Lance might escape judgment, Carol would undoubtedly be condemned for getting involved with a married man, a label that could follow her around indefinitely in their small town. Respectable men wouldn't look at a woman with such a reputation, and any who did would risk facing judgment themselves. As Lance pondered, Carol observed him with narrowed eyes. His hesitance worried her. Could it be that, to him, she was just a fling? "Carol, this is all very serious," Lance began cautiously. "For us to be together, it's going to take some time. You understand, I need to divorce Sue in a way that doesn't make me look like the bad guy. Then marry you, so it doesn't seem like I just left my wife for another woman. Especially if you're pregnant. I'll figure it out. But for now, come here." "No," Carol stood, shaking her head and letting her perfectly styled hair bounce over her shoulder. "Sort things out first, then come find me. But don't take too long." With that, she left, her heels clicking angrily down the hallway and echoing in Lance's mind long after she'd gone. Sitting back down heavily, Lance reached into his desk, pulled out a bottle, and poured himself a stiff drink. "Sue, bring me some water," he yelled, immediately wincing from the pounding headache that felt like a hammer striking his skull. But there was no response. "Where is she?" he muttered, dragging himself out of bed and stumbling toward the kitchen. On the table sat a cold plate of food and a piece of stale bread. On the floor, a spoon and a bowl lay tipped over, sauce pooling messily across the floor. "What the," he muttered, anger simmering as he took in the mess. Then, he remembered. He recalled coming home drunk, shouting at Sue, and then hitting her. God, what did I do? A surge of guilt hit him, though it wasn't out of sympathy for his wife. In his mind, she had deserved it. She obviously resented caring for him like a proper wife should. And she couldn't even give him a child. But he'd lost control, and now her parents surely knew about it. His own parents, maybe half the town by now. He knew his father wouldn't judge him for hitting his wife. His father had always said, a woman should know her place. And if she forgets, you remind her, just make sure she understands, and no one else has to know. But Lance had failed to ensure Sue's silence, and now he dreaded to think of the consequences. He had to go over there and make things right. Bring Sue back home and remind her that running to her parents wasn't the solution. Surely, Bob would understand. He was a tough man himself and surely treated his own wife strictly. Lance pictured Jolene, so quiet, so compliant. Straightening up, Lance washed his face, changed his clothes, and set off toward Bob's house. Reaching the gate, he knocked a few times, then walked in without waiting for an answer. "Ah, Lance." Bob's voice greeted him from inside. "What do you want?" "I've come to pick up my wife," Lance replied with a smile, stepping into the room where Bob sat. "To hit her again?" Bob retorted, his smile dark. But Lance brushed it off. "Come on, Bob. Things like this happen. You know how it is, you have to keep a wife in line. Is that right? You think you're the one to teach my daughter a lesson?" Bob stood, taking a step toward Lance. "I've never raised a hand against her. Who do you think you are to hit her?" Seeing the fierce look on Bob's face, Lance felt a flicker of fear and took a step back. "But Bob, she's not my daughter, she's my wife. And a wife needs discipline to know her place." "Her place? Is she your slave?" Bob's voice grew darker. "I didn't give my daughter away to be turned into a punching bag." He raised his rifle, aiming it directly at Lance, and cocked it. "Bob, what are you doing?" Lance cried out, stumbling backward until he was pressed against the door. He quickly slipped out into the yard, with Bob close behind. "Get out of here. And don't you ever show your face here again." Bob's shouts rang down the street. "How dare you hit your pregnant wife?" "Pregnant?" Lance stopped in his tracks, the fear momentarily forgotten. "Sue's pregnant? You didn't even know?" Bob sneered, lowering the rifle. "Yes, she's having a child, but she'll divorce you before it's born." "We'll see about that," Lance yelled back, regaining some of his nerve. "That's my child, and there's no way she'll leave me. This just makes her even more mine." "Oh, I don't think so," Bob replied coolly, then punched Lance squarely in the jaw, sending him sprawling in the dirt. Tyler couldn't sleep. A feeling of unease wouldn't leave him alone. He smoked through a whole pack of cigarettes, but still couldn't calm down. As soon as morning arrived, he headed to the hospital. After roaming the halls with nothing much to do, Tyler stepped outside again. On a whim, he decided to head to the store and pick up something for Sue. Cravings are common in her condition, he thought with a smile. He wasn't entirely sure how he'd deliver the treats, but he figured he'd find a way. Tyler picked out a bag full of fruit and chocolates. While waiting in line, he overheard two women gossiping and inadvertently caught news about a romance between Lance and Carol. His feet seemed to move on their own, carrying him straight to Sue's house. But it was quiet there, and the door was locked. Not knowing where else to go, he headed to her father Bob's place, hoping they could figure things out together. As Tyler approached Bob's house, he heard shouting. Breaking into a jog, he reached the yard just in time to see Bob striking Lance with the butt of a rifle. Tyler stepped through the gate, approaching the scene. "Nice hit," he commented. "Thanks. Where's Sue?" Just then, Sue appeared on the porch, her gaze moving from one man to the next. "Hello, Sue," Tyler greeted, stepping closer and holding out the bag. "This is for you." "Thank you," she said, taking the bag. "How are you feeling?" "Better." "Good," Tyler said gently, and without hesitating, he wrapped his arms around her, kissing her hair. "Things are going to be okay now." Sue nodded and went back inside. Tyler sat down on the bench by the porch and lit a cigarette. Bob sat down beside him, and the two men smoked in silence for a moment. "Bob, I'll get straight to the point," Tyler said, pausing for a breath. "I know I'm older, but I want to ask for your daughter's hand." Bob looked at Tyler thoughtfully. "You know, I don't have a problem with it. Only thing is, my daughter's stubborn." He raised his voice, "Sue." The whole yard echoed. Sue came running out, her face full of concern. "The doctor here has a proposal for you," Bob said with a grin. Sue looked between Tyler and her father, taking a breath. "First, I'm pregnant. Second, I'm still married." "Sue," Tyler said softly, "the main thing is what you want. The rest is up to me." "That's where you're wrong, Bob." Lance's voice cut in as he stood up, clutching his aching side. "You don't have any business telling me what to do. Show some respect." "Respect? To you?" Bob scoffed. "Sue's pregnant. I'm not giving her a divorce." "Who'd want her, divorced and with a kid?" "No worries, Lance," Tyler said, stepping up to him. "I'll take care of that question. Better than her putting up with more of your abuse." "Tyler, you know I'm right," Lance looked to him, trying to find an ally. "Who'd want her, pregnant with someone else's kid?" Tyler walked right up to Lance, looking him straight in the eye. Lance backed away slightly. "I would, Lance. And I swear, if you lay another hand on her," his voice was cold. "That's how it is, then." Lance barely contained his anger but didn't dare make a move. "You'll both regret this." "Oh, really?" Tyler took a step toward Lance, who, reddening with embarrassment, turned and ran from the yard. "Well, turns out your husband's a real piece of work," Bob muttered. "How did we not see that before? So, what's the plan now?" "I'm going tomorrow to file for divorce, that's the end of it," Sue said firmly. "I'll go with you," Tyler added. "I think you'd better move in with us," Jolene said, looking at Tyler. "Sue's going to need more help soon, and I'll be here to support her." "Yes, Tyler," Bob agreed. "You can't be with her all the time. You're busy with your work and all the folks here who need you. It'll be easier for her here at home." Tyler looked over at Sue, who smiled shyly and dropped her gaze. "All right. You're probably right. I work a lot and won't be able to be with Sue as much as she'll need," Tyler agreed. "But I actually have a better idea. If you don't mind, I'd like to add an extension to your house, maybe 2 extra rooms. How does that sound?" "Of course, we'd love that." Bob and Jolene responded enthusiastically. "But where would we get the money?" "Don't worry about that. While I was serving, I hardly spent any of my salary, and I haven't touched my pension since I left. That should be enough to cover the extension. Think of it as my wedding gift to Sue." "So, Bob, your job is to find some good builders. You're already looking at the best builder there is." Bob grinned. "Just you? I mean, I don't know a thing about construction." "That's fine. Dominic will help." Carol was looking herself in the mirror. It had been 3 months since she told Lance about her pregnancy. She'd hoped that by now she would actually be pregnant after stopping her pills. But nothing had happened. The day after her announcement, she learned that Lance's wife, Sue, was also pregnant and filing for divorce. Lance tried to brush it off, saying Sue had lost her mind, but rumors began circulating that he'd actually beaten Sue, causing her to leave him. At first, Lance seemed determined to win Sue back, which made Carol uneasy. But then, almost overnight, his attitude changed, and he proposed to her instead. Carol didn't hesitate and accepted immediately. Wedding preparations began, with Lance insisting that the wedding be grander than his first one with Sue. Carol started openly visiting Lance at the house he had once shared with Sue. More often than not, he met her at the door already drinking, launching into the same rants each time. "Let them see what they lost. My new wife's prettier, we'll have my child right away, and everyone in town respects me more now. And Bob, I'll have him thrown out of his job, just like I did with Lorraine." True to his word, Lance fired Sue's parents from the farm. He kept waiting for Bob and Lorraine to come crawling back, begging him to rehire them. But instead, the town was buzzing with news that Sue was engaged to a surgeon who was taking on full financial responsibility for her family. This ate away at Lance. Fueled by alcohol, he stormed into the hospital one day, charging at Tyler with clenched fists. "Who do you think you are, calling all the shots around here? I'll make sure you're run out of this town, back to wherever you came from." With a swift, subtle move, Tyler subdued him in an instant. His voice was low and calm. "Listen carefully," Tyler said. "If you so much as give my family a dirty look, I'll break your bones in ways that'll never heal. You'll be a cripple for the rest of your life. Do you believe me?" Lance stared at Tyler, spellbound, seeing the cold intensity in his eyes, a look of a man with nothing to lose and everything to protect. "I said, do you believe me?" Tyler repeated, gripping Lance's shoulder firmly. Lance nodded frantically. "Yes. Yes, I believe you. I believe you." Tyler released him, and Lance practically stumbled out the door. Tyler then turned to Carol, who was sitting frozen in a chair, eyes wide with fear. "I didn't see anything," she stammered. Tyler and Sue had a quiet ceremony at the town hall and went home, where Sue's parents, her Uncle Dominic and his wife, and a few close family friends were waiting to celebrate. As the taxi approached the edge of town, Tyler asked the driver to stop. "Sue, do you mind walking the rest of the way?" he asked. "Not at all," she replied, curious. "Why?" "I just want a little time alone with you." Hand in hand, they strolled down the path. For the first time in ages, Sue felt calm, protected, and deeply happy. Tyler had one arm around her shoulders, his other hand holding hers gently. The ring he had placed on her finger felt like it had always been there. Suddenly, he stopped, turned to her, and kissed her. They stood there, wrapped up in each other, unaware of anything else around them. Now, at last, they had the right to be together. The next morning, the newlyweds left on a short getaway, and Bob and Dominic got to work on their ambitious construction plans. "Your stomach's not showing at all," Lance said, pulling Carol close and patting her flat belly. "It's still early," Carol replied, feigning a casual tone. "Plus, it's my first pregnancy. Maybe that's why my belly isn't showing yet." "But Sue's belly is already pretty visible," Lance persisted. "Well, she's farther along," Carol retorted quickly. "And how would you know that?" "My aunt told me." "Anyway, why does it matter? Isn't it a good thing I'm staying slim longer? Or do you want me to get big fast? Are you going to love me when I'm bigger?" "As long as you keep having kids, yeah," Lance chuckled. Carol forced a laugh, but inwardly she was panicking. She had to come up with a plan soon before her secret was exposed. The next Monday at work, Carol, ignoring the patients waiting for treatment, rushed straight to her aunt's office. "Auntie, this is urgent." Alarmed, Mrs. Perkins stepped out of her office, hurrying to the treatment room with her niece. "Carol, what's wrong? Is it the baby?" Mrs. Perkins knew nothing about Carol's deception. Though she disapproved of her niece's affair with Lance, she'd softened when Carol claimed to be pregnant. "Yes. It's about the baby." Carol's face was full of distress. "There isn't one. There never was. I lied to get Lance to marry me. Now he's demanding to see a belly. How am I supposed to make one appear?" "Carol, you," Mrs. Perkins pressed her hands to her face. "Aren't you ashamed? How could you come up with such a thing? How? It's what you do when you want to get married. Who would have thought it wouldn't happen? You could have figured. Look how long Lance was with Sue before she got pregnant. But that was Sue. Maybe she had issues. I'm perfectly healthy. Maybe, but Lance, he might not be. Plus, all that drinking, he's not exactly helping himself. I didn't come here for a lecture, Auntie. I need help." "Help? What am I supposed to do?" "I don't know, just do something, please." "Well, if finding another father is no longer an option, then the only solution left is to fake a miscarriage." "That's it. A miscarriage? How do I do that?" "We'll think of something. Carol, you need to learn to cook already." Mrs. Perkins set a bag of food on the table. You're the one who got married, not me. I can't keep cooking for you after work. I'm trying, Auntie, I really am. I just can't seem to get the hang of it, Carol said, putting on a helpless look. Then tell that to your husband. I'm worn out. Just hang in there a bit longer, Auntie. I'll figure it out soon, I promise. Sure you will, Mrs. Perkins muttered as she unpacked a pot of soup, a pan of mashed potatoes, and a skillet with meat. Cook your own way, he's drunk half the time anyway. It's not like he'll care what it tastes like. Carol kept silent. She couldn't tell her aunt that Lance, sober or not, expected perfect order in the house, crisp sheets, and a fresh, delicious dinner on the table. Every day after work, she rushed home to clean and do laundry. Lance insisted on a spotless home but never lifted a finger himself, seeing it as strictly a woman's job. Heavy footsteps sounded on the porch, and Carol and Mrs. Perkins exchanged a look. Lance had been coming home late these days, but today, he appeared right on time. "Oh, we have company," Lance said, sounding sober. "Well, wife, set the table." "Mrs. Perkins, what brings you by? Missed your niece already? I thought you two saw each other every day." Mrs. Perkins pursed her lips. "Lance, you're not taking good care of your wife. Look at her, she's pale and thin. That's not good for her, not in her condition. What am I supposed to do?" Lance shrugged. "I told her to quit her job and stay home. She's better off at work where she can at least take a break from all the housework. You two are living here together, yet she's the only one doing anything around the house." "Well, she's the woman, isn't she? I'm not supposed to be doing house chores." "Not chores, just help her out a bit." "Mrs. Perkins, should I have the baby for her too?" Lance scoffed. "You might have to. She's on her feet from morning to night, and she needs rest. No one can keep going like that. This is doctor's advice. At this rate, she's going to lose that baby." "What?" Lance's face turned red with anger. "That's not happening, you hear me, Carol?" He leaped up from his chair, charging toward Carol, but she suddenly doubled over, clutching her stomach and moaning. "Ah! My stomach. It hurts. You see what you've done?" Mrs. Perkins rushed over to her niece and led her to the bedroom. "Such delicate women," Lance muttered. He opened the fridge, grabbed a beer, and took a big swig. "Dad, when did you manage to do all this?" Sue asked as she and Tyler sat at the table set in celebration of their return. "Worked from morning till night." Jolene smiled. "Incredible work," Tyler said, looking at Bob with admiration. "Well, we didn't do it alone. Had to call in some help," Bob said modestly. "And was there enough money?" Tyler asked with concern. "Didn't you check your own account?" "There's enough in there for another house like this," laughed Dominic. "Really?" "Honestly, I didn't know," Tyler chuckled. "I hadn't checked the account even once. I figured there was a decent amount, but not this much." "Well then, let's drink to your return." Bob raised his glass, and the men clinked glasses heartily. While the newlyweds were away, Bob and his helpers had managed to build an addition to the house nearly as large as the original. They'd also replaced the roof, creating a unified one for the entire big house, and now they were planning to finish a couple more rooms upstairs. "Well, we might not get to the second floor this year," Dominic mused, "but we'll have the rest ready soon. I promise it'll be done by Christmas." "Thank you." Tyler looked at Sue, grinning. "I sure got lucky with my wife." "What is it with these women?" Lance complained to his drinking buddy, Johnny, as they sat in his kitchen. "One couldn't even get pregnant, and when she finally did, she didn't tell me. Maybe if I'd known, I wouldn't have hit her. But she immediately filed for divorce. Now, some other man is going to raise my child. Then take the kid from her, Lance. You've got connections, money." "I would, but that doctor threatened me," told me not to go near them or I'd regret it. And Carol? She's a joke too. Told me she can't do housework or she'll lose the baby. Why are they all so weak? Just then, Carol walked in, followed by Mrs. Perkins. Oh, my wife's back. Lance shouted cheerfully. So, everything good with the baby? No, Lance, Carol said, choking back a sob, I lost it. What? How'd you lose it? Lance roared, jumping up. Have you lost your mind? He lunged at her, striking her multiple times. Johnny and Mrs. Perkins tried to pull him off, but Lance, in a rage, threw them aside. Mrs. Perkins, get help! Johnny shouted. Thankfully, she ran out of the house just in time to bump into Tyler. Tyler! Help! Lance is beating Carol. Tyler rushed into the house and pulled the deranged Lance away from his wife, hitting him several times until Lance slumped to the floor. Tyler then turned to Carol, her face bloody. He instructed Mrs. Perkins to bring the medical kit, and after assessing Carol's other injuries, he sent Mrs. Perkins to call the sheriff. Sue walked leisurely down the street. There was a bustle at home as they prepared for her father's birthday, and she'd been sent to buy candies. Since there was still plenty of time, she decided to swing by the hospital to meet Tyler after work. Entering his office, she saw Carol. It had been almost a month since Lance had assaulted her. The bruises and cuts on her face had healed, but the vibrant beauty she once had was gone. Carol no longer wore makeup or styled her hair, and her nurse's scrubs hung loosely. Sue knew that Carol had divorced Lance, who was now in a holding cell. After Carol filed her complaint, Lance had tried to attack her again, forcing the sheriff to place him in custody. Who do we have here? Tyler said with a smile as he stood up to greet Sue. Approaching her, he kissed her tenderly. Did they send you out for a walk? Yep. And I thought I'd pick you up while I was at it. Hi, Carol. Hi. That bump's growing, huh? Carol nodded toward Sue's belly. Oh, yes. Soon I won't be able to walk at all, Sue laughed, but then a sharp pain made her gasp. Sue, what's wrong? Tyler asked anxiously. Here, sit down, take a moment. No, it's fine. It's mostly past, ow. The door opened, and Mrs. Perkins entered, quickly assessing the situation. How long have you felt like this? She asked Sue. Since morning, I guess. It wasn't so frequent at first. Tyler, aren't you a doctor? Can't you tell that your wife's in labor? Tyler looked dazed, unsure what to do. Got it, Mrs. Perkins said, eyeing Carol. Go tell the driver to bring the car around. We're heading to the maternity ward. Wait, where? Sue asked, alarmed. Ow. To the hospital, where else? After sending Carol to Sue's parents, Mrs. Perkins and Tyler helped Sue into the ambulance and headed to the city hospital. Tyler returned close to midnight. Lights were on in every window of the house. They'd been waiting for him. Everyone was gathered around the table, their eyes on him as he entered. The silence was so intense that they could hear the wind rocking the lantern outside. Finally, Dominic broke the silence, raising a glass and extending it toward Tyler. Tyler took it, glanced at the group, and exhaled. A girl. A daughter, he announced, downing the glass in one gulp. Everyone cheered, laughed, and glasses clinked. Well, Bob, there's your birthday gift from your daughter. All right, show me my gift. My granddaughter. Bob demanded eagerly. They gently placed the tiny, rosy bundle on the bed and began unwrapping her. The baby was sleeping peacefully, but once all the blankets were removed, leaving only her soft swaddle, she woke up, opened her bright blue eyes, and smiled. Jolene and Dominic's wife teared up instantly, and Dominic gave Tyler a proud smile. Tyler, with his arm around Sue, couldn't take his eyes off his daughter. Bob, however, stood frozen, his face expressionless. His granddaughter's large blue eyes and innocent smile looked so much like. Tyler, he shouted as the baby burst into tears. They quickly ushered Bob out of the room. Half an hour later, the three men stood smoking on the porch. Tyler, how could you? Bob stared intently at his son-in-law. Bob, don't you know how these things happen? Dominic tried to lighten the mood. That's not what I meant. Bob barked. That's exactly what I meant. Dominic replied. It was obvious from the start they loved each other. They just let society's opinions get to them. But what will people say when they see the girl? Bob, are we back to that? Dominic's right. We don't need to worry about what people think. I love Sue, and I'll protect her and our daughter. Let people talk if they want, as long as it's in whispers, so none of us have to hear it. Especially not my family. You don't even know how happy you've made me with this news. Yes, absolutely. We're looking forward to it. Tyler hung up the phone, a broad smile lighting up his face. It was near the end of the workday, and the call had clearly lifted his spirits. He looked over at Sue and Carol, who were watching him with curiosity. It's an old classmate, Sam. He's thinking of moving and was wondering if there might be a place for him here. Is he a surgeon too? No, he's a cardiologist. Oh, that's wonderful, Tyler. Carol replied. Absolutely. Now, ladies, time to head home, the day's done. Actually, Tyler, could you walk me home? I heard that Lance was released, Carol said. What? Sue looked at Carol in surprise. His father hired a good lawyer, now he's home until the trial. Oh no, Sue shook her head. Of course, Carol. We'll make sure you get home safely. Looks like you're all set up here, came a familiar voice as the door swung open without a knock. Sam. How are you? Why didn't you let me know you were coming? I'd have picked you up. Tyler said, standing to greet the towering man. They shook hands, then embraced. What, you think I'm a kid who needs picking up? Sam grinned. So, where's my workspace? First, let's get you settled with a place to stay. After that, we'll find you a spot to work. You'll have your pick. Sounds good. But heads up, I'm not crashing with you guys. I need a room to myself. Some nice little old lady's house would be perfect, someone who'll cook home meals. I'll pay well, of course. We'll find someone. Let me ask Carol, Tyler said, just as she walked into the room. All done with the bandages and shots, there were quite a few today, she trailed off mid-sentence, her eyes widening as they landed on the tall man standing nearby. Hi. Good afternoon, Sam stammered, unable to take his eyes off her. Carol, meet Sam, our new cardiologist. He needs a room somewhere, ideally with someone who can take care of the housekeeping. He's willing to pay well. Actually, my aunt has a spare room. It just needs a bit of tidying up. Perfect. Sam boomed, making Carol's eyes widen in surprise. Sam, try not to scare people. Carol, don't worry, he just has a big voice. He's actually very gentle. I hope so, Carol murmured. To hell with all of you. Lance shouted, throwing his glass to the floor, where it shattered into tiny shards across the living room. Grabbing his jacket, he stormed out the door. Fine, go, someone yelled after him. You think everyone should live by your rules? You've lost 2 wives, maybe the problem isn't them, it's you. Maybe you should stop drinking. Lance's face turned crimson with anger. This was not the Christmas he'd envisioned with his family. He made his way back to his place, and, without even taking off his coat, grabbed a bottle from the fridge and took a long drink straight from it. I'll go to Carol's, he decided. When he knocked on her door, a huge man answered. What do you want? The man asked. Is Carol home? Lance stammered, caught off guard. She's here. What do you want with her? The man repeated. Sam, who is it? Came Carol's cheerful voice as she walked out. Some drunk guy asking for you, Sam replied, glancing at Carol. What? I'm no drunk. Lance forgot his fear and advanced toward Sam. Do you even know who I am? I know who you are, Sam replied calmly, and I'm telling you, you're not welcome here. Got it? What? Who do you think you are? Lance lunged at Sam, who simply gave him a shove, sending him staggering backward. You're not welcome here, Sam repeated, just as calmly, and shut the door. I'm sorry, Carol said, staring down at the floor, avoiding Sam's gaze. What for? He replied, wrapping his arms around her. I told you, your past doesn't matter to me. Whatever happened before us is just that, the past. I'm grateful you were honest with me because it means I can respond the right way when situations like this happen. Carol looked up at Sam, deeply appreciative. Tyler. Get up. Old Ray pounded on the door. What's going on, Ray? Bob opened the door, scowling. If you wake my granddaughter, I swear, he growled, ready to push Ray back out, but Tyler came out of the bedroom, buttoning his shirt. What's wrong? It's Lance, he's dead. I think. Over by the club, in the snow. Sue, go tell Lance's parents. Mom, the baby's on you. Let's go, Ray. Tyler called out as he threw on his jacket. Not dead, just barely alive, Tyler muttered, looking around as the ambulance finally pulled up, with Bob driving. As they loaded Lance into the vehicle, his parents ran up. What a fool, his father George cursed, helping lift Lance into the ambulance. This is all your fault, his wife snapped at him, likely for the first time in her life, before pushing him aside and climbing into the ambulance, slamming the door in his face. Drive, quick, she shouted. Bob smirked but started the engine. Tyler, do something. I'm doing everything I can. Now calm down, or I'll need to treat your nerves next, Tyler said firmly, focusing on removing Lance's coat to examine him. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you all, George said later, as evening fell. Tyler and Bob had just returned from the hospital, where Lance remained with his mother. Lance's father had waited in Sue's house for news the entire time. Lance was saved, he'd suffered frostbite, but no permanent damage. Can I see my granddaughter? George asked. No, Bob replied calmly. She's not yours. She's Tyler's. The man's eyes flashed with anger, but he quickly calmed, taking a deep breath. He looked at Sue and finally said, I don't blame you, Sue. I just realized what kind of person I raised. Then he took his hat and headed for the door. Thank you again, he said before leaving. Doctor, will I still be able to have kids? Lance asked hopefully. The doctor looked at him, puzzled. Do you believe that frostbite can restore fertility? Restore fertility? Lance asked, confused. You're infertile. You can't have children. And frostbite doesn't help with conditions like this. What do you mean, infertile? Lance sprang up from the bed. You didn't know? I'm sorry. The doctor gave him a sympathetic look. Do you have children already? I'm sorry. No, I don't have kids. Lance sank back onto the bed, stunned. The doctor launched into a lengthy explanation of the reasons behind Lance's infertility, but Lance barely listened. His mind was racing with questions. If he couldn't have children, who was the father of Sue's baby? Was Carol ever pregnant? And if she was, then, whose child was it? I need to go home, he said finally. But I'm checking myself out. Hello, son. I'm sorry I didn't answer your letters sooner. I was angry with you, what can I say? But I did read them, every one. And I let your mother read them too, just without the envelopes, so she wouldn't know the return address and be tempted to write you back. A lot has happened since you left. Old Ray passed away. Lance put the letter down, staring out the window without seeing. Old Ray. Always kind-hearted, cheerful, the life of the town. Now that role belongs to Sam. Carol gave him twin boys right after the wedding. She didn't even tell Sam she was pregnant until the last minute. Even though he's a doctor, he didn't catch on right away. She gained weight but never mentioned it. But once he found out, he married her on the spot. Tyler and Sue had a son too, about a year after their daughter. Sue was just starting college. But she finished, now she teaches at the school, and she's pregnant again. The hospital's been renovated. They added a second floor, now it's got a full ward, and patients come from all over. Every graduate dreams of studying medicine and working there someday. Mrs. Perkins retired as soon as she heard she was going to be a grandmother. A lot has changed here since you left. Lance set the letter down again, gazing at the frosted window, his thoughts drifting back to the day he'd raced out of the hospital after learning about his infertility. He'd hailed a taxi, planning his revenge on his ex-wives the whole way. But somewhere along the drive, he changed his mind. What would revenge solve? Would it heal him? Bring him peace or a family? Besides, he knew his ex-wives had protectors now. He stopped the taxi halfway and told the driver to turn around. Back in town, he found the nearest train station and boarded the first train out. After a full day of travel, he got off at a deserted station and just started walking, letting his feet guide him wherever they wanted to go. Eventually, he reached a small house, and when he knocked, a young woman with tear-streaked cheeks opened the door. She later explained that her husband had been killed in the forest by a falling tree, leaving her alone with 2 young children. Her son was 2, and her daughter had just been born. Somehow, they ended up living together, and Lance decided to start fresh. He got a job at a sawmill, quit drinking, married Helena, and adopted her children. He told her everything about his past as soon as he proposed. "If you're not afraid of who I used to be, marry me," he'd said. Helena hadn't been afraid, and every day since, she thanked God for the day Lance had knocked on her door. Every year, just before Christmas, Lance would sit down and write a letter to his parents, describing his life from that year. At first, he waited for a response, but eventually, he stopped expecting one and just wrote anyway. He knew, somehow, that they were reading them. The door opened, and Helena and the children returned from visiting her mother. Lance had stayed behind, feigning a headache, almost as if he sensed something was coming. And here it was, a letter from his father. Helena noticed the letter and walked over. "Lance, is that what I think it is?" she asked, resting her hand on his shoulder. "Yes, my love," he said, pulling her down to sit on his lap. "It's from my father. I think he forgives me. Dad." The children ran over, one on each side. "You promised that when we got lots of snow, you'd build us a sled hill. There's tons of snow outside." "Well, then tomorrow, I'll get started." Lance kissed each child on the top of their head. "We'll sled, and then we'll go on a big trip to see your grandparents." "We have more grandparents?" "Yes, now you do." The letter ended, "You should come visit, son, bring your wife and the kids. Your mother would love to see you, just once. See your brothers. And forgive an old man. Your mistakes are mostly my fault. We're waiting for you. Mom and Dad. Grandma and Grandpa."